Bramwell Kersey didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed through the door of Red Willow's kitchen like he owned the floorboards beneath his boots, and maybe in his mind he already did. Lenora Wrenfield was at the table sorting seed receipts when he walked in, and the way he looked at her, not at her face, but through her, like she was furniture that hadn't been moved yet, made her fingers go still on the paper. "Tell Thorne I'm done waiting," Kersey said. He set a folded document on the table without looking at it. "That's my final offer. He signs by Friday, or I start calling in every debt this valley knows he owes." He let his eyes drag around the kitchen slowly, the way a man does when he's already measuring the walls for new paint. Place has good bones. Shame what neglect does. He walked out without closing the door. Lenora sat there in the draft for a long moment before she reached over and shut it herself. If you've been watching this channel for any time at all, you know we don't tell small stories here. This one's about a woman who stopped believing in her own future, a man too stubborn to ask for help, and the winter that forced both of them to stop running. This one is going to stay with you. Subscribe to the channel right now if you haven't already. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Montana, 1887, and meet Lenora Wrenfield on the worst morning of her carefully constructed life. She had arrived at Red Willow Ranch in early April with one trunk, $17 in emergency money she never intended to spend, and the kind of composure that takes years of grief to build properly. Lenora Wrenfield was 30 years old, and she moved through the world like a woman who had learned that wanting things was the first step toward losing them. The stage from Billings dropped her at the crossroads 3 miles from the ranch. The driver pointed east and said, "Follow the fence line." He didn't offer to wait. She didn't ask him to. She walked the 3 miles carrying her own trunk because the handle on the left side was more reliable than strangers. Garrick Thorne met her at the gate, which surprised her. Most ranchers sent a hand. He was sent a hand. He was taller than from the letter broad, through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something honest rather than handsome. He looked at the trunk she was dragging and then at her, and whatever calculation he ran behind his eyes, he didn't share it. He just came through the gate and picked up the other end of the trunk without asking. "Kitchen's warm," he said. "You eat yet?" "I'm here about the housekeeper position," Lenora said. "I know why you're here. You eat yet?" She had not eaten since the night before. "I'm fine. That's not what I asked." He carried the trunk up to the porch, held the door, and pointed her toward a chair at the kitchen table where a pot of stew was already working on the stove. He ladled a bowl without ceremony and put it in front of her like the question was settled. Lenora sat down and ate. She was hungrier than she'd admitted to herself, and the stew was better than she'd expected from a bachelor ranch. They talked about the position while she ate. The work was real work: cooking, preserving, keeping accounts, managing the household supply orders, so Garrick didn't have to ride into town every other week for something he'd forgotten. She had experience in all of it. He asked a few direct questions and listened to the answers without interrupting. When she finished the bowl, he stood and took it to the basin. "Wages are fair," he said. "You'll have your own room. I don't run a social house, so you won't be expected to entertain, but the hands eat supper at the main table on Sundays, and I expect that to continue." He turned and looked at her steadily. "You have any questions? When do I start?" "You already have," Garrick said, and went back out to finish the afternoon's work. Lenora sat in the quiet kitchen for a moment, listening to the sound of the wind against the walls and the pot still ticking on the stove. She had expected something harder to navigate suspicion, or the particular kind of looking over that some men did when a woman arrived alone. She'd prepared for it. She hadn't prepared for stew and a straight answer. She got up, found the apron hanging on the peg beside the stove, and tied it on. The first month was purely about learning the machinery of the place, what Garrick kept where, how the supply ledger had been organized badly, which of the hands was reliable with the horses, and which one needed watching around the saddle room. There were 4 regular hands, a taciturn older man named Olin, who'd been with the ranch since before Garrick inherited it, 2 brothers from Wyoming called Dex and Cobb, who worked hard and argued constantly, and a young man named Fitch, who was 17 and trying very hard to be older. Lenora kept the household and stayed out of the cattle work unless information's car desk that just seems relevant. The supply ledger she reorganized in the second week because the old system would have caused them to overorder flour and run short on salt by winter small things. But small things became large things in January. Garrick looked at the new ledger without comment, but after that he left the ordering decisions to her entirely. Took that as a review. Her room was small and faced north, which meant cold mornings, but she'd been sleeping in a room that faced north for most of her adult life, and had learned that what direction your window faced had nothing to do with whether you woke up rested. She had her trunk. She had her books. She had the small lockbox where she kept her savings, which had grown by another modest amount the first month. She was not happy, exactly, but she was not unhappy either, and for Lenora, stability without pain was a thing to be protected. She did not let herself want more than that. Garrick Thorne had not meant to hire a woman who would reorganize his thinking along with his supply ledger. He'd hired her because he needed someone competent, and her letter of application had been the only one in 6 months that addressed the actual work rather than the applicant's good character and religious observance. He didn't need a woman of good character. He needed someone who could calculate how many pounds of salt pork would carry 4 men through a Montana winter without guessing. Lenora had included the calculation in her letter, unsolicited. He'd hired her by the next post. What he hadn't calculated was how much the sound of another person moving through the house would change the quality of the mornings. He'd lived alone for 3 years, since his younger brother Rafe had gone to work a ranch down in Wyoming. And he'd accommodated himself to the silence, the way you accommodate yourself to a boot that doesn't quite fit. You stop noticing after a while, or you tell yourself you've stopped noticing. Lenora didn't make noise for the sake of noise. She wasn't a chatterer. But there was the sound of the kitchen coming to life before he was fully awake, the smell of coffee that had been properly made, the particular rhythm of someone who knew how to move through a space efficiently. He found himself waking up easier than he had in years. He did not examine this observation too carefully. She'd been there 6 weeks when he came in from a fence inspection in the far north pasture to find her at the kitchen table with the ranch's financial records spread in front of her. He hadn't asked her to look at them. He stopped in the doorway. "You're overextended on the Kersey note," she said without looking up. He stepped inside and hung his hat. "I know. The interest schedule means you're carrying it through 2 more winters before you're clear, assuming good yields both years." She paused. "What happens if one of those winters is bad? Then I manage." She looked up then. "What does manage mean, specifically?" He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. It was not how he'd expected the evening to go, but she had a way of asking questions that made avoidance feel like more work than the truth. "It means I've done it before. That's not the same as having a plan." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She looked at him for a moment, then back at the ledger. "You have a hay surplus from this season. If you sell half to the Denison Ranch, they came up short. I heard it from their cook. When she was in town, you cover the interest on the Kersey note through next spring. It doesn't solve the whole problem, but it gives you room." Garrick was quiet. "You heard about the Denison shortage from their cook." "I pay attention." She didn't say it like a brag. She said it like a fact. "You want me to draft the letter to Denison?" He sat there looking at the ledger she'd spread out, the careful handwriting marking the columns she'd been working through. Nobody had looked at his books since his brother left. He hadn't realized how much he'd been managing alone until he saw it reflected back at him from across the table. "Yes," he said, "draft it." By August, Lenora had settled into the rhythm of the ranch in the way a person settles into a place they weren't planning to love without noticing it happening, until one morning they wake up and realize the landscape looks different. Not prettier, just theirs. She knew which gate latch was stiff after rain. She knew that Olin took his coffee with nothing in it, but would eat 3 pieces of cornbread if it was made with buttermilk. She knew which days Garrick came in late, and when to have supper kept warm without comment, and which evenings he needed the kitchen table to work through numbers, and would appreciate if she took her mending elsewhere. She knew the exact way he went still when he was angry, not loud, just very precise and very quiet, like everything in him was focusing to a point. She knew the way he laughed when something genuinely struck him, which was rare enough to be notable, and the particular way he looked at the mountains in the evening when he thought no one was watching. She knew she was learning these things. She told herself it was the same thing she'd always done, studied the people around her in order to navigate them without friction. That was a skill. That was practical. She had almost convinced herself this was true when she dropped a ceramic pitcher in the kitchen, and Garrick came in from the porch and helped her clean up the pieces without being asked. And when she reached for this same shard at the same time and their hands were close enough together that she pulled hers back fast, he looked at her with the kind of attention that had nothing practical in it. She stood up and said there was laundry to check. He let her go. But she felt his eyes on her back until she was through the door. Late September arrived with the first real frost, and with it, Bramwell Kersey. Kersey had inherited most of his land from his father and had spent the subsequent 20 years turning it into leverage. He was 45, well-dressed for the territory, and the kind of man who was unfailingly polite in public and efficient in private about getting what he wanted. He rode up to Red Willow on a Wednesday afternoon with 2 men behind him and tied his horse at the rail like he'd been expected. Garrick met him in the yard. Lenora watched from the kitchen window, not because she was hiding, but because she needed to know. She couldn't hear everything. She heard enough. The word "debt" 3 times. She saw the way Garrick's jaw set when Kersey handed him the envelope. She saw Kersey gesture toward the house, toward the land, the slow proprietary sweep of a man taking inventory. She saw Garrick's hands go still. After Kersey and his men rode out, Garrick stood in the yard for a long time. Lenora put the kettle on. She had it ready when he came inside. He sat down and looked at the envelope on the table in front of him without opening it again. He'd already read it. He just sat there. "He's calling in the note early," Garrick said finally. Lenora kept her voice steady. "Can he do that? The agreement has a provision. If he determines the ranch is in jeopardy," Garrick pressed his mouth together. His determination, his definition. "I signed it 6 years ago when I needed the capital fast and didn't have time to have a lawyer in Billings read it properly. And he's saying the ranch is in jeopardy. He's saying a lot of things. He's saying it's a kindness." His voice was flat and dry. "He's offering to buy the property at assessed value minus what I owe him. So I'd walk away with." He stopped. "Almost nothing," Lenora said. "He built in the interest wrong," Garrick said quietly. "Or right, depending on which side you're on. I ran the numbers wrong 6 years ago because I was tired and desperate, and he was helpful, and I needed to believe it would work out." He finally looked at her. "I should have been more careful." She sat down across from him. "What are you going to do?" He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the window frame. Fitch was doing something noisy in the barn. "I don't know yet," Garrick said. "I need to think." She nodded. She didn't offer him false comforts. She'd learned that he didn't want it, and she didn't have the kind of heart that could deliver it convincingly when the stakes were real. What she did was stay at the table instead of finding some excuse to give him the room to himself. It seemed like what was needed. After a while, he said, "Thank you." "I didn't do anything," she said. "You're here," he said simply. Then he picked up the envelope and went to his study to think through the numbers alone. Lenora sat at the kitchen table and looked at the window for a long time. The glass rattled in its frame. The wind was coming out of the northwest, which Olin said meant snow by November at the latest. She sat there until the kettle went cold, and she tried very hard not to think about the fact that when she'd heard Kersey talking about the ranch being in jeopardy, her first feeling hadn't been worry about her position. It had been worry about Garrick. She didn't know what to do with that, so she got up and started making supper. October, the month that changed everything. The letter came from Billings with the Thursday Post, tucked between an invoice from the feed merchant and a circular about a cattle association meeting. Lenora almost didn't notice the handwriting. It was an older style, slightly formal. The ink pressed harder than necessary, like the man writing had been concentrating on every word. It was addressed to her. She sat down and read it twice before she understood what she was holding. Emmett Voss. He had written to her mother's address in Missouri, the last address he'd had for her, 8 years old now, and the letter had been forwarded 3 times across 3 different states before finding her here at Red Willow Ranch, Montana Territory. The envelope was soft with handling, the corners worn to a gentle fray. She'd buried Emmett in her heart so completely that his name felt like something dug up from frozen ground. They had been 22 years old. He was a carpenter, quick-handed and easy with laughter, and she had been so sure of him that she'd started hemming the wedding linen she'd been given by her aunt in Fredericksburg. Then he'd left for railroad work in Utah with the promise of good money and a proper home. His letters had come faithfully for 4 months, then 1 week of silence, then another, then a year, then nothing. She had eventually put the linen in the trunk unfinished and stopped expecting anything. Now here was his handwriting on paper that smelled faintly of dust and a long journey. He had been hurt, a collapsed scaffolding near Salt Lake City that had taken 3 months of his memory and 6 months of his legs. He'd been moved twice while unconscious, his belongings scattered. By the time he could ask questions, the railroad crew had moved on, and the letters he'd sent had no address that still applied. He had spent 4 years, he wrote, trying to reconstruct enough to find her. A former crew member who remembered her last name. A letter to the Missouri County Records Office. 3 wrong addresses. I have not stopped looking for you, he wrote. I understand if the years have closed that door. I would only ask the chance to explain myself in person, if you will allow it. I am coming west in any case. I have work in Billings starting in November. If you wish to see me, you know how to reach me through the post there. Lenora folded the letter slowly and put it in her apron pocket. She went back to the stove and stirred something that didn't need stirring. The thing about Emmett Voss was that she had loved him without reservation at 22, and the silence had not killed that love so much as it had sealed it in amber preserved and unreachable and used, over the years, as proof that she'd been right not to love anything unreservedly again. And now here it was, reaching for her from a worn envelope. She didn't know if she still loved him. She knew she was afraid of what it meant that he had come back, and she knew she was equally afraid of what it meant that her first thought, her very first, shameful, complicated thought had been about Garrick. Cooked supper, she served it. She said nothing to anyone. But at the table that evening, she was quieter than usual, and she felt Garrick notice, and she looked at her plate rather than at him. She wrote to Emmett 3 days later. A short letter, careful, telling him that she was employed at a ranch north of Billings and that she was willing to see him when he arrived, if it seemed appropriate. She did not tell him she had thought of him as a closed door. She did not tell him what she had been feeling for the past 3 days. She did not tell Garrick about the letter. She carried it to the post herself on her next trip into town, and she told herself she was simply being orderly about it, dealing with the situation that had arrived, managing it as she managed everything else. But the woman who walked back from the post office was not entirely the same woman who had walked up to it, and she knew it. By the first week of November, the weather had turned properly cold. Olin said the winter coming felt heavier than last year, and Olin was rarely wrong about such things. Garrick had been working 16-hour days, trying to shore up every weakness in the ranch's position before the snow came fences reinforced, livestock counted and moved, the root cellar stocked to the ceiling. He was also quietly working through every legal angle he could find on the Kersey note. He had written twice to a lawyer in Billings. He'd found 2 other ranchers in the valley who had similar provisions buried in agreements with Kersey neighbors named Yates and Dunmore, and he'd been meeting with them quietly, trying to understand if there was a collective case to be made or if each man was simply alone with his own trouble. Lenora knew about all of this. Garrick had begun talking to her about it in the evenings, not always asking for anything in particular, sometimes just working through the shape of the problem out loud. She had learned that this was how he thought, not in circles, but in straight lines that needed to be spoken before he could see whether they were straight. She asked questions when she had them. She didn't pretend to have answers she lacked. One evening in early November, Fitch came in from the barn with news that a rider had asked at the gate for Miss Wrenfield. Garrick looked up from the table. So did Lenora. He said his name was Voss, Fitch said, with the complete neutrality of a young man trying not to be interested in something he was very interested in. I told him it was late. He said he'd come back in the morning if that was better. Silence in the kitchen. The lantern threw a steady light across the table. It's fine, Lenora said. Tell him morning is fine. After Fitch went back out, Garrick was quiet for a moment. Someone you know? He said, and his voice had exactly the careful calibration of a man asking a simple question that is not in fact simple. Lenora set down the mending she'd picked up. Someone I used to know, she said. A long time ago. I'll explain it properly when I can. He looked at her steadily for a moment, not with accusation, not with anything she could easily name. Then he nodded and went back to his papers. She did not sleep well that night. Emmett Voss arrived at Red Willow the next morning at 9 o'clock, which was late enough to be polite and early enough to mean he'd been awake for hours. He was older. Of course he was older, they both were. His hair had gone a bit gray at the temples, and he moved with a slight irregularity in his left leg that hadn't been there at 22. But he was recognizably Emmett. The eyes were the same, direct, dark brown, with that particular quality of looking at her like she was worth understanding. They stood in the yard, and Lenora felt 8 years compress into a single pressurized moment. "You look well," he said. "You look tired," she said. He laughed, and that was familiar too, the laugh that meant she'd said something accurate that he hadn't been expecting. "I am tired," he said. "It's a long way to track someone down." They walked. It was cold, the grass brittle underfoot, and she showed him the perimeter of the kitchen garden and the south pasture, without really knowing why she was showing him these things. It was something to do while the conversation found its own level. He told her everything in detail, the accident, the hospital that had moved locations, the worker's ledger that had recorded him under a spelling error. He told her about the years of searching with the methodical patience of a man who builds things, one piece fitting to the next. He told her he was sorry, and it was not the generic sorry of embarrassment. It was the specific sorry of a man who understood what his absence had cost. She believed him. That was the terrible, simple fact of it. She believed every word, because the story fit perfectly with the Emmett she had known, and because she'd spent 8 years telling herself he was gone, and here he was, not gone at all, just lost. "I'm not the same person I was," she said finally. "Neither am I," he said. They were walking back toward the ranch house by then, and she could see the kitchen window from the path, could see, or imagined she could see, the shape of someone moving behind it. "I need time," she said. "I need to think." "I know," Emmett said. "I'm not asking you for anything today. I just needed you to know the truth of it." He stopped walking and looked at her with the same directness she remembered. "I'm going to be in Billings through March at least. I'm not running anywhere." She nodded. He left before noon, and she watched him ride down the fence line road toward the crossroads with a feeling she couldn't name, something between grief and relief and a new kind of confusion that was worse than either. When she turned around, Garrick was standing on the porch. He had a mug of coffee, and he was looking at the road where Emmett's horse had gone, and he had the expression he wore when he was being very precise and very quiet about something. "You want to talk?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. "All right," he said, and he went inside without pressing her. She stood in the cold yard by herself for a long time. This was the life she had built, stable, functional, no unnecessary wanting. And now there were 2 men inside the perimeter she'd constructed, one from 8 years ago with a claim she couldn't argue, and one from right now with a claim she hadn't let herself examine, and the walls she'd put up so carefully weren't doing what walls were supposed to do. She pressed her hands together against the cold. She needed to think clearly. She was beginning to suspect that clear thinking was no longer the thing she was most afraid of. That evening she sat down at the kitchen table after supper and made a decision. Garrick had gone to his study. The hands had retired to the bunkhouse. Kitchen was hers for a few minutes, with the stove ticking and the wind starting to build outside. She made the decision the way she made most decisions under pressure, not by working through what she wanted, which felt too dangerous to examine, but by working through what she could do without, which felt safer. Could do without uncertainty. She had built her entire life on the premise of certainty. Emmett was a certainty she understood. He had been real. He had been good. The love she'd had for him at 22 had been a real thing, and maybe that thing was recoverable from the amber it had been sealed in. Garrick was... She stopped that thought before it completed itself. She pulled a piece of paper toward her and began to write. She wrote to Emmett that she was glad he'd come. She wrote that she needed more time, but that she wasn't asking him to disappear again. She wrote that she was willing to think about what might be possible between them, in some careful future tense that she was not yet ready to make present. She sealed it and left it on the stack for tomorrow's post. Then she went to her room, sat on the edge of her bed, and looked at the trunk in the corner. She hadn't opened it since she arrived at Red Willow. There hadn't been any reason to open it. The things inside, the savings, the books, the unfinished linen, were things she kept but didn't look at. She didn't open it now either, but she looked at it for a long time. Because somewhere between writing that letter and sitting here in this room, she had understood something she didn't want to understand. She was not writing to Emmett because she still loved him. She was writing to Emmett because Garrick Thorne had started to feel like something she could lose, and she had decided somewhere in the past month. Somewhere in the ordinary mornings, she kept telling herself she didn't need, that she would rather go back to something old and manageable than risk something new and alive and terrifying. She was choosing Emmett because she was afraid. She understood this clearly. She sat with it. And then, because Lenora Wrenfield had always been more honest with herself than was comfortable, she let herself feel exactly how much that cost her. The wind pressed against the window. Outside, the first real snow of November began to fall. The snow that fell the night Lenora wrote that letter did not stop for 3 days. It was not a blizzard, not yet, not the kind that would come later and change everything, but it was enough to close the mountain roads and make the ranch feel smaller. The way any enclosed space does when the world outside goes white and silent and you are left with only the people inside it. Lenora moved through those 3 days with a particular discipline of someone who has decided something and is waiting for the decision to feel right. It didn't feel right. It felt like wearing someone else's coat, functional, adequate, wrong in a way she couldn't point to specifically. She didn't let herself examine that too closely. The letter went out with Dex on the 4th day when the road cleared enough for him to make the supply run into town. After she handed it to him, she went back into the kitchen and started on bread, because bread required sustained attention, and sustained attention was what she needed. Garrick came in at noon for coffee, knocked the snow from his boots at the door the way he always did, and poured his own cup without asking where the pot was, because by now he always knew where the pot was. He sat down across from her and watched her work the dough for a moment. "Roads are passable," he said. "I know, I sent Dex out." "Good." He drank his coffee. "Emmett Voss is the man you were going to marry." Stopped kneading. Not long, just a beat, barely noticeable. Then she kept going. "Yes," she said. "How long ago?" 8 years. Almost 9. He turned the mug in his hands. He was looking at the table, not at her, and now he's come back. Explained himself. "The accident, I believed him." "Do you still—" Garrick stopped. He looked up. "That's not a fair question." "Ask it anyway," she said. He held her gaze. "Do you still love him?" The dough under her hands was overworked. She could feel it resisting. She should have stopped a minute ago. "I don't know," she said. "I know that sounds like an answer that means yes." "It sounds like an answer that means you don't know," Garrick said. He stood up and rinsed his mug and put it on the hook. "That's honest. I'll take honest over comfortable any day." He picked up his hat from the peg and looked at her one more time from the doorway. "You don't owe me an explanation, Lenora. I just want you to know that whatever you figure out—" He stopped again. He was not a man who said things halfway, so the stopping was noticeable. "I'm listening," she said. "I know," he said. Then he went out. She stood at the table and pressed her palm flat against the dough and breathed. The bread came out fine. She'd been worried it wouldn't, but it came out fine. November deepened. The Kersey problem deepened with it. Garrick received a response from the Billings lawyer that was precise and discouraging. The provision in the note was aggressive, but not obviously illegal, at least not by the letter of territorial law as it currently stood. There might be grounds for challenge if other affected parties could demonstrate a pattern, but that would take time and money, both of which were in short supply. The lawyer estimated a minimum of 4 months before any hearing could be organized. Kersey had given Garrick until the end of January. Lenora read the lawyer's letter twice. Then she sat down and worked the numbers 3 different ways, looking for the angle Garrick might have missed, the gap in the calculation that would open up a different path. She didn't find one. The math was what it was. She took the letter to Garrick in his study that evening. "I went through it," she said. The finances. He looked up. He'd been at his desk since supper. Papers spread in a circle around him, like a man drowning slowly in his own ledgers. And if you sell the northern timber rights, not the land, just the rights to the Whitmore Company out of Helena, it's enough to cover the interest payment through March. Buys the lawyer time. She set her notes on the desk beside his. I wrote to the Whitmore outfit last week. General inquiry, without your name. They responded. They're interested in this region. He looked at her notes. Then he looked at her. You wrote to them last week, he said. I wanted to know if the option existed before I brought it up. I didn't want to offer you something that wasn't real. He was quiet for a long moment. The timber rights were something I was keeping in reserve. I know. You told me when I reorganized the land inventory. You said they were your last resort. They were. They still are, she said. But last resort is different from gone. You sell the rights, not the land. When the note is settled and there's money again, the timber's still there. He picked up her notes and read through them carefully. She waited. Outside the study window, the wind was making a low sound against the eaves, the kind that meant it was picking up direction. This would work, he said finally, not perfectly. But it buys you the time the lawyer needs. Yeah. He set the notes down and leaned back in his chair. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with today's work, the kind of tired that's been accumulating for years and just occasionally shows its depth. I keep thinking I should have seen this coming. Kersey's been moving pieces for at least 3 years. I was watching the cattle and the weather, and I wasn't watching him. You were running a ranch, Lenora said. Not a chess game. In this valley, they're the same thing. She didn't argue that because he wasn't wrong. Write to Whitmore, he said. Under your name or mine? Yours. This is your ranch. He nodded. I'll draft it tonight. I'll look it over in the morning, she said, and turned to go. Lenora. She stopped. Thank you, he said. And it was not the thank you for an errand well run. It was something heavier than that, more careful. She could hear the weight of it. Don't thank me yet, she said. Thank me when it works. She went back to her room and sat at the small writing table under the north window and looked at the darkness outside and thought about what she had just done, which was to spend a week solving a problem for a man she was trying not to feel things. For while simultaneously writing letters to a man she was trying to feel things for, she was aware this was not a sustainable arrangement. She was also aware she was very good at sustaining unsustainable arrangements. She had been doing it her whole life. She opened her journal, which she kept in code, more out of habit than real secrecy, and wrote 3 lines. Then she closed it and went to bed and slept badly. Emmett came back to Red Willow on a Thursday in the second week of November, and this time Lenora was the one who went to the gate. He looked better than he had the first visit, a little less hollow around the eyes, the exhaustion of the long concert replaced by something that was either hope or the careful performance of it. He'd brought coffee from the bakery in town, wrapped in cloth to keep the heat, which was such a specific Emmett gesture, practical and thoughtful at the same time, that it hurt her in a way she hadn't expected. They sat in the cold yard on the fence rail, with their hands wrapped around the cups, and talked. Really talked, this time. Not the careful navigation of the first meeting, but the actual conversation underneath it, the one that had been waiting. He asked about her life. She told him about the years after his letters stopped, the younger siblings, her father's illness, the series of positions in other people's households, the slow construction of a life she could depend on. You stopped expecting things, he said, not as a judgment. Just naming what he heard. I got practical, she said. There's a difference, maybe. She looked at her coffee. I'm not sure I remember what the difference feels like. He was quiet for a moment. Do you want to remember? She looked at him. He had that directness she remembered, the quality of asking a question and waiting for the real answer, rather than the convenient one. She had loved that about him. She still respected it. I don't know if wanting things is safe for me, she said. I keep testing the theory, and it keeps coming back the same. What theory? That wanting leads to losing. He turned the cup in his hands. You could argue that not wanting leads to losing too. You just don't notice, because there's nothing specific to mourn. That was a more precise observation than she'd expected, and it landed somewhere she hadn't left a door open for it. She felt it settle. That's fair, she said. I'm not trying to argue you into anything, Emmett said. I'm trying to tell you I'm real and I'm here, and I still think about the person you were at 22 with complete admiration. The person you are now. He stopped. He exhaled slowly. I've been looking for the woman I left. I think the woman here is someone different, and I think I'd like to know her, too, if she's willing. It was exactly the right thing to say. It was honest and generous, and it acknowledged the gap without trying to paper over it. She would have respected him for it, even if she didn't have 8 years of preserved feeling somewhere underneath everything. She thought about Garrick. She stopped thinking about Garrick. Can I think? She said. You've been thinking since I sent the letter, Emmett said. I'm not in a hurry. I'm in Billings through winter. Think as long as you need. She nodded. He left within the hour, and she watched him go, and she stood at the gate a long time after the sound of his horse had died away. When she turned around, Garrick was not on the porch this time. The yard was empty. The kitchen window was lit, which meant supper was close, which meant she needed to go in. She went in. The thing about ranch life in winter is that proximity becomes inescapable. When the days are short and the cold is serious, and the work requires that everyone do their part without complaint, you come to know people in ways that open spaces and pleasant weather never require. Lenora knew Garrick's silences the way she knew the weather, not by any single feature but by their texture. There was the silence that meant he was working, the silence that meant he was worried, the silence that meant he was listening to something the rest of them weren't hearing yet. By mid-November, she had learned a new one. It came in the evenings when Emmett's name entered the conversation indirectly. A reference to the visit, a mention of the Billings Road, anything that pointed toward that part of her life without touching it directly. Garrick would go quiet in a particular way, not cold, not shut down, but very still. Like a man standing outside in wind that isn't bad enough to come inside for, deciding whether to wait it out. She noticed. She didn't say anything. And because she didn't say anything, he didn't either. And the silence between them accumulated like snow quietly, without any single flake making a difference, until one morning there was more of it than there had been before. The evening Olin's horse came up lame was the evening it broke. It was not a dramatic crisis. A shoe had come loose, and the animal had worked the hoof on frozen ground long enough to bruise the sole. Garrick had spent 2 hours in the cold barn, with Olin sorting it out, and he came in later than usual with the look of a man whose body is done for the day, but whose mind isn't. Lenora had kept supper warm. She served it without comment. They were halfway through the meal, just the two of them, the hands having eaten earlier, when Garrick said, without preamble, "Are you going to go with him?" She looked up. "What?" Emmett Voss, he looked at her steadily. Clearly been working up to this for a while. The words came out too level for spontaneity. "Are you going to leave with him when his work in Billings is done?" Put her fork down carefully. "I haven't decided anything." "All right." That she stopped. Started again. "I'm not hiding anything from you. I genuinely don't know. I'm not accusing you of hiding anything." He went back to his food. "I was asking a direct question. You said you don't know." "That's fine." "Is it fine?" He looked up again. "Is it actually fine?" she said, and she heard the edge in her own voice, something sharpening under the surface. "Because you keep asking me these questions and then going completely still. And I don't know how to read it. I don't know if it's fine with you. Or if you're just—" "What do you want me to say?" he said, not harshly. Directly. "Something true," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Kitchen was very quiet around them, the stove, the wind, nothing else. "All right," he said. "Something true. I don't want you to leave." He said it plainly, without decoration. "Not for him, and not for any other reason. I know you didn't come here to have someone want you to stay, and I know you've been careful not to want things, and I know I'm not—" He stopped. His jaw worked slightly. "I know this is a hard life, and I know the ranch is in trouble right now, and I know I'm not offering you anything easy." He looked at the table. "But I don't want you to leave." "That's true." Lenora sat very still. She had prepared, in some part of her mind, for a range of possibilities from him. Continued careful distance, maybe. Some kind of employer managing a complicated situation language. Even something awkward and half-stated that she'd have to interpret. She had not prepared for that, for the flatness and the weight of it. Not a romantic speech, not a bid for anything specific, just a man telling her an uncomfortable fact because she'd asked for something true. She didn't know what to do with it, so she did what she always did when the emotional ground shifted faster than she could track. She said, "I appreciate that," in a voice that was too controlled, and she picked up her fork, and she went back to eating. Felt him look at her. She felt him decide something. He went back to eating, too. They finished the meal in silence. Cleaned up. He went to his study. Everything was exactly the same as every other evening, and completely, permanently different. She lay in bed that night and stared at the ceiling and thought about Emmett's coffee from the bakery, and Garrick's silence, and the unfinished linen in the trunk in the corner, and how she was 30 years old and had spent so long not wanting things that she wasn't sure she'd recognize what she wanted if it sat down across from her at her own supper table. It was Dex who brought the news about Yates in the second to last week of November. He came in from the feed run with the kind of look on his face that means trouble has arrived at someone else's house first, and he found Garrick in the barn and told him what he'd heard in town. That Bramwell Kersey had sent a formal legal notice to the Yates Ranch 2 days prior, identical in language to the one he'd sent Garrick, calling in the full note under the jeopardy provision. Garrick came in and told Lenora. She was at the kitchen table with the supply ledger. She was always at the kitchen table with something. Yates too, she said. Same provision, same timing. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. He's moving fast. He wasn't supposed to move this fast. He found out about the lawyer, she said. Garrick looked at her.
What?
Kersey has someone in town who talks. It's how he knew about your debt situation in the first place. He knew which months were bad before he ever made his offer. If he found out you'd written to a lawyer in Billings, he'd move before the challenge could be organized. She turned the supply ledger over and picked up her pencil. How does Kersey know what you know before you've acted on it? Garrick's expression shifted, the kind of shift that happens when a piece you've been looking at from the wrong angle suddenly shows its real face. Fitch, he said slowly. She looked at him. Fitch. Not intentionally. His voice was careful. Fitch goes to town more than any other hand. He's young. He talks. He's not careful about what he says to who. He pressed his mouth together. I'm not angry at him. He doesn't know what he's passing along. But Kersey has someone listening for it. That would explain the speed. He leaned forward on the table. If I can't communicate about the legal challenge through normal channels, write the letters from town, Lenora said. Through me. I have a box at the Billings Post. Kersey has no way of connecting that to you. Garrick looked at her. That's your personal correspondence address. It's a mailbox, she said. It serves whoever needs it. She looked at him steadily. This is your ranch, Garrick. I've been watching you try to hold it alone for 6 months. Let me actually help. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, all right, in the voice he used when he meant it completely. They spent 2 hours at the kitchen table that evening, drafting the letter to the Billings lawyer together. It was careful, precise work, every word chosen to reveal the minimum necessary while building the clearest possible argument. Garrick knew the legal geography. Lenora knew how to organize an argument so a stranger could follow it without knowing the background. At some point during the second hour, she realized they'd stopped talking about what they were writing and were simply writing it, completing each other's sentences, one of them leaning forward while the other read back what was on the page. The back and forth of two people who have been thinking in parallel for long enough that the seams don't show anymore. She noticed this and felt it and said nothing. She sealed the letter and wrote the Billings address in her own hand and set it with the Morning Post. Emmett came to Red Willow one more time in November, unannounced, on a Saturday when the sky was the particular color that Olin called snow-ready. He asked Lenora to walk with him, and she did. They went along the south fence line where the ground was flat enough for easy walking. He told her he had been offered an extended contract in Billings construction on a new public building, 6 months of guaranteed work, possibly more. He would be in the territory for a while. I'm not trying to pressure you, he said. I just wanted you to know the timeline. I know, she said. Do you know what you want? He asked it gently, the way a man asks a question when he suspects the answer and wants to give it room to arrive. She looked at the fence line stretching ahead of them. The cedar posts, most of which she'd watched Garrick replace in September. The wire that ran between them, new on the north side and aging on the south, something she'd noted in the supply ledger and flagged for spring. She knew this fence. She knew why each section was the age it was. She knew the ranch the way she knew her own hand's every imperfection, every repair, every corner that needed watching. "I'm not sure I love you anymore," she said. The wind moved across the dry grass. "I know," Emmett said. "I think I've known it since the first visit." He was quiet for a moment. "I think I loved who you were, and I think who you are now is something I don't entirely know." "I don't think the person you're looking for is still here," she said. "I don't mean that cruelly. I know you don't." He stopped walking and she stopped beside him. "Is there someone else?" She thought about Garrick at the kitchen table 2 nights ago, the letter spread between them, his voice low and focused, the way he'd said all right when she offered the mailbox, like it was a thing he'd been waiting to say. "I don't know," she said. "That means yes," Emmett said. Not unkindly. She didn't argue it, he exhaled. "I won't pretend that's easy to hear." He looked at the sky, at the clouds moving low and heavy from the northwest. "But I came back to find you. I didn't come back to make you into someone you're not." He looked at her. "Whoever she is now, I hope you let her want something." She felt the back of her throat tighten and blinked it away. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said, with a quiet echo that didn't sound like imitation but landed that way, and she realized he'd probably heard her say that before. He gave her a small, rueful smile. "Take care of yourself, Lenora." He walked back to his horse alone. She stood at the fence line until he was out of sight, and then she stood there a while longer, letting the cold air do the work that tears would have done if she were a different kind of woman. She walked back to the ranch house. The sky was darkening fast. Olin came out of the barn and looked up. "Going to be a bad one," he said. "Tonight?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not tonight. But coming. Maybe a week, maybe 2. He squinted at the northwest horizon. "Something's building out there. Feels like more than just snow." She looked where he was looking. She didn't know enough about Montana winters to tell what she was seeing. But she trusted Olin the way you trust someone who's been right before when it mattered. She went inside and wrote nothing in her journal that night. She sat in her room with the lamp low and thought about what Emmett had said. Let her want something, and thought about the packed trunk in the corner that wasn't packed anymore, but still felt like a packing trunk. Still felt like a held breath, an exit she hadn't quite closed the door on. She thought about what it would mean to close that door. Thought about what she was afraid of, specifically if she did. Came up with a list. It was a long list. Most of it, when she looked at it honestly, came down to the same thing. She was afraid of loving something too much to survive losing it. She'd lost things before and survived. She knew this. She also knew that surviving and living are different countries, and she'd been in the first one for a long time. She looked at the trunk. She looked at the window. She went to sleep. The week that followed was ordinary in all the surface ways. The ranch work continued. The supply ledger was updated. Garrick rode out with the hands to check the north fence before the serious cold settled in, came back with 3 fence posts that needed replacing, replaced them the next day with Dex's help. Fitch turned 18, and Cobb produced a bottle of something that Lenora chose not to ask about, and there was a brief celebration at the bunkhouse that lasted until she could hear it from her room. She and Garrick shared the kitchen table every evening in the comfortable silence that had become their default. He didn't ask about Emmett again. She didn't offer. But something was different, and they both felt it, the way you feel a room shift in temperature, even before you can say whether it's warmer or colder, just different, changed. The air carrying something it hadn't before. One evening he stayed at the table later than usual, reading through the Whitmore correspondence. The timber company had responded with interest, as Lenora had anticipated, and she was finishing the accounts for the week, and at some point the work was done, but neither of them moved. "Emmett Voss isn't coming back," she said. Garrick looked up. "I told him this week," she said. "Not coming here. I told him when we walked. That I wasn't who he was looking for." She kept her eyes on the ledger. "He took it well. He's a good man. He always was." Garrick was very quiet. "I'm not telling you because I want something from you," she said. "I'm telling you because you told me something true and I didn't answer it properly." She finally looked at him. I'm not going anywhere. He looked at her steadily. She could see him deciding something. The same quality of decision she'd seen in the barnyard on her first day, when he'd come through the gate and picked up her trunk without asking. That simple calculation that landed on action instead of hesitation. All right, he said. That's all? It's enough, he said. Then he went back to reading the Whitmore letter. She went back to the accounts. Outside, the wind had picked up from the northwest. Olin's prediction was sitting out there in the dark, building toward something none of them could see yet. She didn't know what was coming. She knew she wasn't going to run from it. For the first time in longer than she could account for, that felt like enough. The Whitmore letter arrived with good news on a Monday, which was the last good Monday for a long time. The Helena Timber Company agreed to the rights purchase at a price that covered the interest payment through March with enough left over to give Garrick a small working cushion. He read the letter twice at the kitchen table, set it down, picked it up again, and read it a third time as if he needed to be certain it wasn't going to change its mind. Lenora watched him from across the table, where she was updating the winter supply calculations. It's real, she said. I know it's real. He set it down. I just don't trust things that solve problems on the first try. Didn't solve it. It bought you time, right? He folded the letter carefully. Time for the lawyer to do what lawyers do, which is take longer than they say and cost more than they quoted. That's accurate, she said, but time is what you needed. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in that neighborhood. You're very calm about it. One of us has to be. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. It was the kind of sound she'd learned to collect without appearing to the rare, unguarded ones that happened when he was too tired or too relieved to manage his own expression. He sent the response to Whitmore that afternoon and wrote the same day to the Billings lawyer with the update, posting both from Lenora's mailbox address in town. When Dex came back from the posts, Garrick stood in the yard and watched him unsaddle with the particular quality of stillness that meant something inside had loosened. Lenora saw it. She noted it. She went back to the kitchen. December came in, hard and clear, sharp, cold, minimal snow, the kind of weather that looks beautiful and kills livestock when they're not properly sheltered. Garrick pushed the herd into the lower, south pastures earlier than planned and reinforced 2 sections of windbreak that had been questionable since October. He was methodical about it in the way he was methodical about everything he cared about, not rushing, not cutting corners, just working through it the way a man does when he understands that each individual step is load-bearing. Lenora organized the root cellar and audited the hay stores and found that they were short, not dangerously, but uncomfortably, by perhaps 3 weeks' worth if the winter ran long. She brought this to Garrick without drama. How short? He said. 3 weeks if we hit February with a bad stretch. Less if it's mild. It won't be mild. He didn't say this with any particular emotion. It was simply a fact about Montana winters, stated by someone who had survived enough of them. What's the option? Denison sold their surplus to a rancher up near Havre back in October. But the Callaway place about 12 miles east still has excess. I heard it from their supply runner when he was at the feed store 2 weeks ago. She handed him her notes. I wrote down what he said. The numbers fit. Garrick looked at the notes. You've been tracking the Callaway surplus for 2 weeks. I track things, she said. He looked at her over the paper. Lenora, what, do you ever stop working? She thought about it honestly. Not really. He shook his head. Not with irritation, but with something closer to bewilderment. The expression of a man has spent 3 years managing a ranch with incomplete information and has recently discovered what complete information feels like and cannot entirely reconcile the difference. I'll ride out to Callaway's tomorrow, he said. Dex can go. You have the north fence inspection. Dex doesn't know what we need. He does. I briefed him last week in case this came up. She took the notes back from him and pointed to the bottom line. That number, that price, those terms. Dex knows not to go above it. Garrick stared at her. You briefed Dex last week. He's more capable than people give him credit for. He just needs to know exactly what he's doing and why. Garrick looked at the notes one more time, then looked at her, then handed the paper back. All right, he said. Dex goes. Dex came back from Callaway's with the hay deal settled at precisely the number Lenora had specified, and he looked slightly proud of himself in a way that suggested he'd been expecting it to be harder. Garrick told him good work. Dex stood a little straighter for the rest of the evening. Olin caught Lenora's eye across the supper table and gave her a nod that meant he'd noticed what had happened and approved of the method. She nodded back and passed the cornbread. It was Olin who came to find her in the middle of the second week of December. She was in the kitchen replying to the Billings lawyer's latest questions about the timeline on the Kersey. The legal process was moving slowly, in the way legal processes do when they're working toward something worth working toward. She heard Olin's boots on the porch and knew immediately that something was wrong, because Olin never came to the kitchen during working hours. He opened the door and looked at her. His face was the same as always, weathered, settled, giving away almost nothing. The almost was doing a lot of work. "There's a rider at the gate," he said. "Kersey's man." She put down the letter. "Which one?" "The one they call Pratt. Kersey sends him when he wants to frighten people without doing it himself." She'd heard Garrick mention Pratt twice without elaboration. The fact that Olin mentioned the fear function directly meant the assessment was accurate. "Where's Garrick?" "North fence. Half a day's ride in this cold." He paused. "Pratt says he'll wait." She stood up. "Let him wait in the yard." "Not in the house." Olin's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did a small adjustment that looked like approval. He went back out. Lenora put on her coat and her work gloves and went to the yard. Pratt was 40 or so, lean in the way of a man who doesn't eat well by choice rather than necessity, with pale eyes that did the particular kind of steady looking that's meant to make people feel scrutinized. He had Kersey's letter in his hand before she'd crossed halfway to the gate. "Message for Thorne," he said. "He's not here. I'll take it." "Thorne. And I'm telling you he's not here. You can leave the message with me, or you can ride back to Kersey and tell him you couldn't complete the errand." She stopped 6 feet from him and kept her voice level. "Either way, you're not standing at this gate past noon." Pratt looked at her for a moment with the eyes that were supposed to be unsettling. They were not unsettling. She had dealt with harder men than this in houses where she'd worked alone. He held out the envelope. She took it, didn't open it in front of him. "Tell Kersey he'll have a response through proper channels," she said. "Not through you." Pratt looked at her one more time, then mounted his horse and rode out without another word. Olin appeared at her shoulder. "That was well done." "He's a delivery man who's been told he's a threat," Lenora said. "There's a difference." She looked at the envelope. "Send someone for Garrick." Garrick arrived back at the ranch 3 hours later, cold through and with the look of a man who'd ridden hard. He read Kersey's letter at the kitchen table without taking his coat off. It was not a legal document. It was a letter, and it was written in Kersey's own hand, which meant he'd wanted it to feel personal. It accused Garrick of attempting to circumvent the terms of the note by pursuing a legal challenge that Kersey claimed was frivolous. It informed Garrick that Kersey had engaged his own legal representation in billing Simeon named Aldred, who had a reputation in the territory, and that the January deadline stood. But the last paragraph was the one that mattered. Kersey wrote that he had become aware that Garrick's household manager had been conducting business correspondence on behalf of the ranch through a private mail address, and that he considered this a deliberate attempt to obstruct his ability to communicate with the ranch's principal. He was formally notifying Garrick that any further communications routed in this manner would be submitted to the territorial court as evidence of bad faith. Garrick set the letter down. "He found out about the mailbox," Lenora said. "Yes, I'm sorry. You thought right," Garrick said. He was looking at the letter with the still, precise expression. "It worked for 6 weeks. He's covering the angle now that it's cost him." He turned the letter over and back. "He's more rattled than he's showing. This letter is angry. Kersey doesn't usually write angry. He doesn't like not controlling the information." "No." Garrick finally took off his coat. "His lawyer is Aldred?" "You know him?" "I know of him. He's expensive and effective, and Kersey doesn't retain him unless he means it." He went to the stove and poured coffee and stood there holding the mug. "This is going to get harder before it gets easier." "I know. I need to write to our lawyer tonight and warn him about Aldred. Change the communication approach, everything through the proper address from now on. No workarounds." He turned. "I'm not asking you to stop helping. I'm asking you to help differently. Tell me how, she said. He looked at her for a moment. The Yates family and Dunmore. Do you know either of them? I've met Martha Yates twice at the dry goods store. We've spoken. Would she talk to you? Honestly, not diplomatically. Lenora thought about it. Yes, I think so. I need to know how Kersey approached them. Not the legal language, the actual conversation. What he said, who was in the room, what he did first. Lawyers build legal arguments. I need to understand how he operates before the law gets involved, because that's where the real pressure is. He sat down. Can you find a way to talk to her without it looking like I sent you? I can have a reason to be in town Thursday. Martha Yates goes to the feed store Thursday mornings. Garrick nodded. He was looking at her the way he sometimes did, the direct, unhurried assessment of a man who was used to reading animals and land and weather, and had recently had to add people to that list. You're very good at this. At what? Seeing what's actually there instead of what people want you to see. She didn't know what to do with that, so she said, I'll go Thursday, and started clearing the supper things. She rode into town Thursday with the supply list as her reason and found Martha Yates in the feed store at 9 in the morning, which was exactly when she'd expected to find her. Martha was 50, wide-faced and direct, with the economy of motion of a woman who had raised 6 children without ever having quite enough time. She looked at Lenora with immediate comprehension when Lenora came through the feed store door. The recognition of a woman who understood what another woman, being at the same place at the same time, probably meant. They didn't talk in the feed store. They walked to the bakery afterward, the way women do when they've reached a silent mutual agreement, and sat at the corner table with coffee. Your man is in the same trouble as mine, Martha said without preamble. He is, Lenora said, and I'm not here officially. I know. Martha wrapped her hands around her cup. What do you want to know? How Kersey approached your husband. What he said, how he said it, what he did before the legal letter arrived. Martha looked at her steadily. Why does it matter? The letter's the letter. 'Cause he did the same thing with Garrick, and probably with the Dunmore Ranch, and if the approach is the same every time, it means there's a method. And if there's a method, there might be a crack in it. Martha was quiet for a moment. Then she said he came to visit in August. Social call, he called it. Brought a bottle of something decent. Sat with my husband for an hour talking about the valley, the weather, how cattle prices were running. She turned the cup. He didn't mention the note. Not once. He asked about our youngest son, how he was doing in school, whether we'd thought about his future. Friendly. Specific, she looked up. The kind of specific that means he'd done research. He knew about your son before he came. He knew everything before he came. My husband didn't realize it until afterward, that everything Kersey mentioned had been information he'd gathered, presented back like conversation. She shook her head. By the time he left, my husband felt like they'd had a good talk. A week later, the legal letter arrived. Lenora felt something solidify in her thinking. He does the visit first. Makes you feel known. Then the letter. Makes you feel like he's reasonable and the law is just business, Martha said. So when the letter comes, you're already thinking of him as someone who might be willing to talk. Someone who might be persuaded. She pressed her lips together. He's not persuadable. That's the thing my husband learned too late. Did he do the same with Dunmore? From what I hear, yes. Visited in September. Dunmore thought it went well. Martha looked out the window at the gray December street. Kersey's been planning this for at least a year, probably longer. He identified which ranches had vulnerable notes, made social contact, then triggered the legal provision once he'd done enough to make each man feel like negotiating was possible. Lenora sat with this for a moment. There's something else, Martha said. Tell me. Kersey owns a stake in the Billings Land Title Company. Not public knowledge. My husband found it buried in a filing. If Kersey gets the ranches he's going after, the transfers all go through that company. She looked at Lenora directly. He's not just buying land. He's collecting fees on every transaction, too. This was the crack. Not in the legal argument, the lawyer would have to determine that, but in the portrait of what Kersey actually was, which was not a creditor calling in legitimate debt, but a man who had constructed a system for extracting wealth from struggling ranchers in multiple directions simultaneously. That was a different argument. That was the kind of argument that moved public opinion. And in a territory where public opinion could determine whether a legal challenge got community support or died in isolation, it mattered. Lenora thanked Martha Yates with genuine warmth. They paid for their own coffee. They went back to their separate errands without any obvious connection between them. Riding back to Red Willow in the cold, Lenora turned it over in her mind, the land title company, the social visits, the precision of the research Kersey had done on each family before he arrived. This was the shape of the man, not a bully, something more patient and more dangerous than that. She needed to get this information to the Billings lawyer before the January deadline without using the mailbox. She needed to get it to the Yates and Dunmore men without going through Garrick directly, because Garrick was already being watched. She was still thinking about it when Red Willow came into view, and she noticed immediately that something was wrong. There were two horses at the rail she didn't recognize, and Fitch was standing outside the barn with the look of a young man trying to appear unconcerned and failing entirely at it. She rode in and dismounted and handed her horse to Fitch before he could say anything. "Who's inside?" she said quietly. "Two men," Fitch said. They said they were from the Territorial Land Office. They asked to look at the ranch boundaries, and Garrick let them into the study. "How long have they been there?" "About an hour." She went into the house. She went straight to the study and knocked once and opened the door without waiting. Garrick was at his desk. Two men sat across from him, both in decent coats, one older with a leather satchel, one younger with a notebook. The older one looked up at Lenora with the mild irritation of someone being interrupted. "My housekeeper," Garrick said, in a tone that was perfectly flat. "She manages the property records. Whatever you need from the land documentation, she'll need to be present." Lenora came and stood at Garrick's shoulder. She looked at the documents on the desk, surveying maps, boundary descriptions, the kind of paperwork that gets requested when someone is preparing a title challenge. "Which section are you verifying?" she asked the older man. He looked at his satchel, then at her. "The northeast quadrant. Standard boundary confirmation." "Who requested the confirmation?" Pause. "It's routine. Routine confirmations come through written notice 10 days in advance," she said. "We received no notice. So either this isn't routine, or there's been an administrative error." "Chisholm." The younger man had stopped writing in his notebook. The older man looked at Garrick. Garrick looked back at him steadily and said nothing, because Lenora had said the necessary thing and adding to it would only dilute it. The older man gathered his papers. He said they would return with the proper documentation and that he apologized for any inconvenience, in the tone of a man who is not actually apologizing and knows everyone in the room knows it. He and the younger man left without anything from the desk. Garrick waited until he heard their horses move away from the rail. Then he said, "How did you know about the 10-day notice?" "The land office posted the procedure requirements in the county bulletin last March. I filed it." "You filed the county land office bulletin." "I file things I might need." He looked at her. "What did you learn in town?" Pulled up the chair the older man had vacated and sat down and told him everything Martha Yates, the social visits, the land title company stake, the systematic pattern of it. She told him in the order it mattered, not the order she'd learned it. Garrick listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Title company," he said. "That's the piece. That's what I think too. If the lawyer can establish that Kersey has a financial interest in the transaction outcomes through a company he secretly controls, he's stopped. That changes the nature of what he's doing. It's not a creditor collecting. It's a system. Yes. That information needs to reach our lawyer and the Yates and Dunmore men." "I know. I've been thinking about the method on the way back." She looked at him. "Martha Yates will talk to the Dunmore family herself if I ask her. She's been wanting to talk to someone." She paused. "For the lawyer, I think we go in person. You and me, together, through the front door of his office in Billings. No more letters. Kersey will know. Kersey already knows we're fighting him. The secrecy served its purpose when we needed time. Now we need to stop looking like we're hiding and start looking like people who are building a case." She met his eyes. "He does the visits to make people feel like negotiating is possible. We need to stop seeming negotiable." Garrick held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, When can you be ready to ride to Billings? Monday, she said, if the weather holds. The weather didn't hold. The first warning came from Olin on Friday evening, the same instinctive reading of sky and air that he'd been offering all autumn, but this time with a specificity that was different from before. Came in from evening rounds and stood at the kitchen door and said, "It's coming." Not Sunday. Could be Sunday night. Garrick looked up from the table. "How bad?" "Bad," Olin said. And Olin was not a man who used the word carelessly. They spent Saturday preparing. Every preparation Garrick had made in October and November was good, but good preparation and adequate preparation were different measures under a real Montana blizzard. And what was coming down from the northwest had a character that the earlier snows hadn't had. Garrick and Olin read it in the same way in the pressure of the air, in the way the horses were acting, in something that wasn't any single thing but the sum of many small things adding to a total that was unmistakable if you knew how to read it. Lenora helped with what she could help with. She moved supplies from the outer storage to the house. She added 3 extra layers to the water barrel covers. She made sure the root cellar door closed properly and sealed the gap at the bottom of the barn door with the packed straw method Olin had shown her in October. She also found the grazing maps. Garrick had drawn them himself over several years, hand-drawn on heavy paper, marked with the irrigation cuts and fence lines and terrain features that didn't appear on any official survey. Kept them in the study under the geological charts. She'd seen him reference them twice when he was planning grazing rotations and had noted where they were filed without any particular intention at the time. She pulled them out Saturday afternoon and spread them on the kitchen table and studied them. There was something about the northern quadrant that she'd been thinking about since November, since the day she'd stood at Kersey's south fence line and watched Garrick working the herd, and noticed that the old irrigation cut running along the boundary was deeper than it looked from a distance. She'd made a note of it and filed the note the way she filed everything, and hadn't thought of it again. She thought of it now. If Kersey's northern fence failed, if it failed badly, in a blizzard, with frightened cattle, the natural flow of the terrain would push the animals south and east, directly toward Red Willow's lower pasture and the frozen creek that divided the properties. The creek would be impassable in a hard freeze. The livestock would bunch against it. Terrain would funnel them. She traced the irrigation cut on the map with her finger. If you opened a section of Red Willow's own western fence and drove the cattle toward the cut instead of the creek, the cut would funnel them north and away from the danger. Away from the frozen water, away from the packed, panicking mass that killed animals by compression and cold. The problem was that driving them through Red Willow's western fence put them directly across the winter wheat field. Stared at the map. She put it away. She told herself it was a hypothetical. Kersey's northern fence was aging, but not critically damaged. She'd heard Garrick say so. The blizzard might not be as bad as Olin predicted. There were 10 other variables that would have to go wrong simultaneously for the specific scenario she was imagining to be necessary. She went back to helping with the preparations. The blizzard arrived Sunday at midnight. It didn't ease in the way some storms do, a beginning that gives you time to think about what's coming. It arrived at full force, and the sound of it coming through the walls of the ranch house was the particular sound of something enormous and indifferent, doing exactly what it was going to do, regardless of what anyone had prepared. Lenora lay in her room and listened and didn't sleep. By morning, the snow was 2 feet deep and driving horizontally, and there was no question of anyone go anywhere, for any reason that wasn't essential survival. The hands stayed in the bunkhouse. Garrick moved between the barn and the house in the careful, measured way of a man who has done it before and knows exactly how quickly a blizzard can turn a 30-foot walk into a serious problem. By midday Monday, the storm had not let up. By early afternoon, Fitch came in from the barn white-faced and breathing hard and said something that made Garrick's whole body go still. "The north," Fitch said. "Something's wrong to the north. I can hear it, even over the wind. Once you knew to listen for it, you could hear the sound low and wrong and growing, the particular roll of many large animals moving fast and frightened in the same direction." Garrick said, "Kersey's fence." He was already moving for his coat. 3 of the hands had come in from the bunkhouse, the same way Fitch had having heard the same sound, coming to report it. Garrick told Dex and Cobb to saddle the two strongest horses and follow him. He told Olin to stay at the barn and be ready with the gates. Lenora was standing in the kitchen doorway. "Stay inside," Garrick said, not looking at her. "Garrick, the creek's icing over and there are hundreds of cattle heading toward it." He pulled his coat on. "This isn't an argument you're going to win tonight." He went out. She stood in the kitchen for exactly 30 seconds. Then she went to the study and got the grazing maps. She spread them on the kitchen table and looked at the irrigation cut again. She looked at the western fence line. She looked at the winter wheat field that sat between them. Put on her coat. She went to the barn and found Olin. "The irrigation cut on the western boundary," she said. "If we open the fence at the northwest corner and drive them toward the cut, instead of letting them pile against the creek, the cut funnels them north." Olin looked at her. He was old and he was not easily moved by things, but she saw something shift in his expression. "That goes through the wheat field." "I know. That's the main crop." "I know," she said. "Is the cut deep enough to funnel them?" He thought about it for a moment that felt very long. "Yes," he said. "If there's enough of them moving fast enough, the cut'll hold them north." "But the wheat opened the northwest corner gate," she said. "I'll get the mare." She took Garrick's strongest horse without asking, because there was no one to ask, and she went out into the blizzard. What happened next took 3 hours, and she could not afterward account for all of it in sequence. The cold was bad enough that time became unreliable, just a series of immediate things requiring immediate response. She found 2 of Garrick's hands who had lost direction in the whiteout and pointed them back toward the fence. She rode the perimeter of the chaos 3 times before she found the angle that worked, the place where the frightened animals could be turned without turning back on themselves. She worked alongside Dex and Cobb, who didn't ask what she was doing there and didn't have time to object. When the cattle hit the open northwest gate and began flowing through onto the winter wheat, it made a sound she would remember for a long time, the thunder of it, hundreds of hooves on frozen ground. Going through the place she'd opened for them. Going away from the creek and the cold and the death by compression, going north through the cut the way she'd traced with her finger on the map. Destroying everything Garrick had planted, saving everything that lived. She didn't let herself think about the wheat. There was no room for it yet. Cobb, who found Garrick. He came back to her through the blizzard on foot, leading his horse and shouting something she couldn't hear, and she rode to him, and he grabbed her stirrup and shouted it again. "Garrick's down." East side. His horse came in alone. She turned the mare east. She found him in a hollow where the terrain dipped behind a stand of frozen brush, half covered by the snow that had drifted against him in the time since he'd fallen. He was conscious but barely his eyes open, tracking her, his breathing shallow and fast in the way that meant the cold had gotten into him deeper than it should have. She got off the horse. She got down next to him in the snow. "Told you to stay inside," he said. His voice was rough and not quite right. "You also trust my judgment," she said. "You can be angry about one of those things when you're warm." She got her arms under his and started pulling. She was not a large woman, and he was not a small man, and it was not a smooth or dignified process. She got him to the mare with Cobb's help. Cobb had come behind her without being asked. She noted and appreciated, and they loaded him across the saddle in a way that would have offended his dignity significantly if he'd been fully conscious to experience it. She led the mare back through the blizzard by hand, because she didn't trust the horse to navigate without a human on the reins, and Cobb walked beside her. And the wind tried 3 separate times to knock her sideways, and she stood into it each time until it stopped trying. When she got back to the ranch house and got him through the door, and got him to the settee in front of the stove, he opened his eyes properly for the first time. He looked at her. She was kneeling beside him. The snow was melting off both of them onto the floor. Her hands were shaking slightly. Not from cold, she thought, or not only from cold. He looked at her for a long moment with those dark, direct eyes. "The wheat field," he said. "Yes," she said. "The wheat field." He held her gaze. He didn't say anything else for a long moment, and when he did speak, his voice was quieter than before, but steadier than it had been in the hollow. "Cattle," he said. "Most of them are safe. Yours and Kersey's both." He closed his eyes, opened them again, the hands. "Everyone's accounted for." Another silence. The stove ticked. Outside, the blizzard was still going, But in here it was just wind and noise, rather than the thing that could kill you. You used the irrigation cut, he said. Yes. I showed you those maps in October. September, you were doing the grazing rotation. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before and could not immediately name. It was too many things at once. He lifted his hand slowly, and she thought he was going to reach for her arm. Instead, he pressed the back of his hand briefly, lightly, against her cheek. You're frozen, he said. You're worse, she said. He dropped his hand. He looked at the ceiling. The wheat field, he said again quietly, himself. I know, she said. You made the right call, he said. I need you to know that I know that. She nodded. She didn't trust her voice entirely. Outside, the blizzard moved over them like something that would last forever, the way bad things always seem like they will, until they don't. The blizzard broke on Tuesday morning, not gently. It stopped the way a very loud sound stops, suddenly, completely, leaving behind a silence that felt physical. Lenora was already awake when it happened. She'd barely slept, moving between the kitchen and the settee, where Garrick lay through the night, checking his temperature with the back of her hand, the way she'd learned to do with sick children, keeping the stove fed, listening to the storm ease from something enormous to something merely bad, to something that was finally over. When the wind stopped, she stood at the kitchen window and looked at the white world outside. The wheat field was gone. She could see the edge of it from the window, or rather, she could see the churned, ruined ground where it had been, the furrows collapsed, the stalks broken under hundreds of hooves. The snow covered most of it now, but underneath the snow she knew exactly what was there. She turned from the window and checked the fire and checked Garrick. His color was better. His breathing had steadied in the night. He'd woken twice once to drink water, once to ask about the cattle count, which she'd answered with the numbers Cobb had brought in around midnight, most of the combined herd safe. Some losses on the Kersey side, where the animals had been running longest before the fence was opened, Red Willow's losses smaller than they had any right to be given the scope of what had happened. He'd listened, nodded, and gone back to sleep without argument, which told her how genuinely exhausted he was. Garrick Thorne did not surrender his waking hours without a fight. She made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and waited for the day to arrive properly. He was on his feet by mid-morning, which was earlier than she would have advised if he'd asked her opinion, which he did not. He moved slowly and with the careful quality of a man taking inventory of his own damage, but he moved, and he went to the window and stood there for a long time, looking at the wheat field, without saying anything. She poured a cup of coffee and put it on the table within his reach and said nothing. He came to the table eventually and sat down. What's the total? He said. Cobb's still counting. The last number he brought in was 43 head lost, but some of those may still be accounted for when we get into the east pasture properly. The snow's too deep for a full count until it settles. 43. He thinks the real number is closer to 30. He was counting everything that wasn't immediately visible as a loss. Garrick nodded. He drank his coffee. The field. The field is the field, she said. It's done. That's 3 months of winter feed. I know. It's also, he stopped, pressed his fingers against the edge of the table. Do you want me to say it was the right call? Because I already told you it was. I don't need you to say it again, she said. I need to know where we are financially without the crop. He looked at her. You're asking about the numbers. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then something in him adjusted, not relaxed exactly, but shifted into the problem-solving register rather than the loss register, which was where he was more comfortable anyway. Without the wheat, the Whitmore payment doesn't carry us as far as we planned. We covered the interest through March, but the operating costs through spring feed, wages, everything else were supposed to come partly from the crop yield. He turned the cup in his hands. Short. Not catastrophically, but significantly. How significantly? 2 months of wages if nothing else goes wrong. 1 month if something does. She was already doing the arithmetic in her head. Callaway hay deal. Can it be renegotiated? We already bought the hay. I know. I'm asking whether Callaway would take a partial payment now and the remainder in spring against a labor arrangement. He's short-handed his daughter, mentioned it to me in October. If we send Dex and Cobb over 3 days a week through the thaw, that's real value to him. Garrick looked at her steadily. You've been thinking about this since you sat down. I've been thinking about it since midnight. He made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. What else? The Yates and Dunmore families, they'll come. Not out of charity, because the cattle you saved were partly theirs and they know it. People in this valley have long memories for both kinds of things. She met his eyes. You let them help you. That's the part you're going to resist. His jaw tightened slightly. I've been managing this ranch alone for... I know how long, she said. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that what happened last night changes what you're owed by this community, and refusing what you're owed doesn't make you independent. It makes you stubborn at the expense of the ranch. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to know, the one that meant she'd said something he couldn't argue with, that he wished he could argue with. You're not easy to disagree with. No, she said. Told that. He drank his coffee, right to Yates today. And Dunmore. He paused. I'll write to them. You tell me what to say. I'll draft it, she said. You sign it. That's what I meant, he said. Kersey arrived on Wednesday. He didn't send Pratt this time. He came himself, which Lenora recognized immediately as a sign that the blizzard had shifted something in his calculation. Men like Kersey sent people when they were managing a situation. They arrived in person when the situation had stopped being manageable. He rode in with 2 men, both of them larger than Pratt, and less interested in pretending to be anything other than what they were. He tied his horse at the rail with the same proprietary ease as always. He knocked this time, which surprised her, until she understood that the knocking was a performance, a signal that he was being reasonable, being a gentleman, in contrast with whatever he was about to say. Garrick was on his feet but not fully recovered, and they both knew it. He'd been upright for 2 hours, and the effort was showing in the set of his shoulders, the careful way he held himself. He met Kersey in the front room rather than the kitchen, a choice Lenora noted and respected because the front room was more formal, and formality was a kind of armor. She came in with him. Kersey looked at her and then at Garrick. Private matter, Kersey said. She stays, Garrick said. Kersey looked at her again, with the particular look he used when he was recalibrating. Not anger, just the cool reassessment of a man noting an obstacle. Then he sat down without being invited, which was his way of taking control of any room he entered. I've come to offer something fair, Kersey said, given what happened. What you're calling fair, Garrick said. He remained standing, which put him above Kersey's eye line, which Lenora suspected was deliberate. Your fence held. Mine didn't. My cattle were on your land. Kersey spread his hands in the gesture of a man acknowledging an inconvenient fact. I'm prepared to offer a settlement on the damages. A fair assessment of the winter wheat loss paid directly. The room was quiet. Lenora watched Garrick's face and saw absolutely nothing move on it. You're offering to pay for the wheat, Garrick said. At fair market value. In exchange for there it is, Garrick said. Kersey paused. Reset. In exchange for a settlement agreement that resolves the note and the legal challenge simultaneously. You receive fair value for the crop, the note is discharged, and you retain the ranch free and clear. Free and clear of a debt I'm already fighting in court, Garrick said. And free and clear of a legal challenge that just got significantly more interesting now that Yates and Dunmore are involved. Kersey's expression didn't change, but his posture did a small, controlled adjustment. The challenge is expensive. For everyone, it is, Garrick agreed. My offer is generous given the circumstances. It's less generous than it sounds, Lenora said. Both men looked at her. She'd been waiting for the right moment, not to interrupt, but to enter the conversation at the point where it would carry the most weight. You're offering to pay for the wheat at market value. But the wheat represents about 40% of the financial gap this blizzard created. The settlement you're describing doesn't close the remaining 60%, it just makes the note disappear, which saves you the legal challenge. She looked at Kersey directly. You're offering to solve your problem at partial cost to yourself and asking Garrick to absorb the remainder. Kersey looked at her with the cold, focused attention he'd dropped on her the first day he'd walked through the kitchen without knocking. You've got a sharp mind for a housekeeper. I've got a sharp mind, she said. The housekeeper part is incidental. The silence stretched. I'm also aware, she said, that the Billings Land Title Company holds a stake you haven't disclosed in these proceedings. That information is currently in our lawyer's hands. Whether it becomes relevant to the court's view of your motivations as a creditor is—" She paused. "Something the court will decide." Kersey was very still. Garrick had not moved. Kersey looked at Garrick. "Where did she find that?" "She finds things," Garrick said simply. "It's what she does." Kersey stood. He was not a man who lost his composure visibly, and he didn't lose it now. But something underneath the composure had changed, a tightening, a recalculation happening behind the courteous expression. He picked up his hat. "I'll have my lawyer contact yours." "That's the correct process," Garrick said. Kersey left without the performative pleasantry of a goodbye. Two large men followed him out. After the sound of the horses died away, Garrick let out a slow breath and sat down in the chair Kersey had vacated. He sat there for a moment, with his elbows on his knees and his head slightly forward, the posture of a man who has been holding himself upright past his body's honest preference. "You all right?" Lenora said. "I will be." He looked up. "The land title company. You told the lawyer." "Last week." "Through proper channels." She sat down across from him. "I didn't know if it would be useful. I wanted it on record before we needed it." He held her gaze. "You've been 3 steps ahead of this since November." "I've been paying attention since November," she said. "That's not the same thing. I got lucky on some of it." "You didn't get lucky on the irrigation cut." She looked at the floor. "That was the maps. And Olin, it was you," he said. "Lenora," he waited until she looked up. "It was you." She didn't argue it. She let it sit there between them the way it needed to. The Yates family arrived Thursday, before Garrick's letter had even reached them, which meant someone in the valley was talking faster than the post. Martha came with her husband, a quiet, solid man named Roy, who had the looks of someone who had been working very hard at being angry about something and had recently decided to direct it productively. They brought 2 of their sons and a load of hay on a wagon that had been pulled through the post-blizzard roads with obvious effort. Garrick met them in the yard. He shook Roy's hand and started to say something about not expecting them so soon, and Roy said, "Your woman opened the fence." And that was apparently the entirety of the explanation required, because Roy went directly to directing the hay unloading without further discussion. Martha came to Lenora in the kitchen. "Everyone knows what you did," Martha said. She was not a woman who built to things, she just said them. "The Dunmore family's coming Saturday. Probably 2 or 3 others by next week." Lenora put the kettle on. It was the practical solution. "It was your crop," Martha said, "or it would have been." "It was Garrick's crop." Martha looked at her with the direct patience of a woman who has raised 6 children and is not interested in false modesty. "You know what I mean." Lenora poured hot water into the pot and didn't say anything for a moment. "Is there anything specific the Yates family needs before spring?" "I'm taking stock of what everyone in the valley is short on after the storm. If we're going to organize the recovery properly, I'd rather know the full picture." Martha looked at her for a long moment. "You're already doing it." "Someone has to." "Yes," Martha said. "But most people wait to be asked." She sat down at the table. "We're short on salt pork and we lost 2 good horses. Roy won't ask for help with the horses because he's proud. If something happened to appear in the spring horse market at a reasonable price, he'd take that differently than charity." Lenora filed this and nodded. "Dunmore, short on hay, same as everyone." Also paused. "His wife is expecting, springtime. She's had difficulty before. If there was someone who could be available or who knew someone available." "I'll find someone," Lenora said. "I know a woman in town with midwifery experience." Martha nodded slowly. "You're going to be something else entirely in 5 years," she said, not unkindly. "You know that." Lenora was not sure what to do with that, so she poured the tea. The Dunmore family came Saturday as Martha had predicted, and 2 others came the following week, a rancher named Calder from the north end of the valley, and the widow Pressman, who ran a modest sheep operation and had heard about what happened from 3 different people before she decided to come see it herself. They came with labor and feed and practical knowledge and the specific competence of people who understand that a community survives winters by being a community rather than a collection of individual operations, each pretending they don't need anything. Garrick received them all with the careful warmth of a man who was learning, day by difficult day, that accepting help was not the same as losing ground. He didn't find it easy. Lenora watched him navigate it, the moments when his jaw went tight and his hands went still, and she could see him reminding himself that Roy Yates and the Calder man were not doing him a kindness out of pity, but were repaying a genuine debt. Cattle in their herds were alive because of what had been done in that blizzard. That was a transaction, not a favor. Garrick understood transactions. She helped him see it that way. She did it quietly. In the evenings, when they sat at the kitchen table, and she'd say something like, "Calder mentioned he's going to need an extra hand for the spring branding. He's short 2 men after this winter." The implication was clear without being stated. The help flowing in had a return, a reciprocity that made it something other than charity. Garrick heard it and incorporated it without needing to be told. That was what she was doing. They were getting good at that, the indirect communication of things that would have been harder to say directly. Kersey's lawyer made contact with the Billings lawyer on the 3rd week of December, and the response from their side contained the land title company information for the first time in formal legal language. The effect was immediate and not subtle. Kersey's lawyer requested a 30-day extension on all proceedings. Their lawyer granted it with the pleasant calm of someone who knows the extension is a tell. Garrick read the communication at the kitchen table and said, "He's buying time." "He needs to assess the exposure," Lenora said. "If the title company stake is provable, which it is, it's in the filings, then he's not just a creditor acting on a valid provision. He's a party with undisclosed financial interest in the outcome. That changes his legal standing. What does it mean practically?" She thought about it. It probably means he settles. He might be willing to discharge the note entirely in exchange for dropping the challenge, rather than risk the court examining his entire operation. Garrick looked at her. That would mean the ranch is free. Yes, he sat with that for a moment. It was a significant thing to sit with 3 years of pressure, the inherited debt, the provision that had given Kersey his opening, all of it potentially resolved by a piece of information she'd gotten from Martha Yates in a bakery on a December morning. Life was not elegant about these things. "Don't count on it yet," she said. "It might mean he fights harder. His lawyer is Aldred, and Aldred doesn't have a reputation for graceful surrenders." "No," Garrick agreed, "but he does have a reputation for protecting his client's other interests. And if Kersey's other interests, the ones that aren't this specific fight, are at risk, if this goes to court publicly," he trailed off, working through it. "Then Aldred advises him to settle," Lenora finished. Yes, they looked at each other across the table. "It might actually work," Garrick said. "It might," she said. We wait. Christmas came quietly to Red Willow. There was no money for celebration and no inclination for pretense, but the Yates family sent a smoked ham that arrived on Christmas Eve, and Lenora used it to make supper for everyone on the ranch hands included at the main table, which became briefly crowded and loud in a way that made the house feel like something different from what it usually was. Fitch got his harmonica out afterward, which he did with the slightly self-conscious air of someone who wasn't sure if it was appropriate, and when no one told him to stop, he played for an hour, with improving confidence. Dex and Cobb argued about something trivial for 30 minutes, which was their form of celebration. Olin ate 3 pieces of Lenora's dried apple cake without comment, which was his. After the hands went back to the bunkhouse, Garrick and Lenora stayed at the table in the comfortable quiet that had become their natural state. The dishes were done, the fire was settled. "Thank you," he said. "For supper," she said. "For the year," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the table in the way he sometimes did when he was saying something he hadn't fully rehearsed. Not evasive, just careful. "You came here in April with 1 trunk," he said. "And by December you'd reorganized the accounts, cornered Kersey's information network, found the legal angle on the title company, and kept my ranch from losing half its cattle in a blizzard." He looked up. "I don't know how to say thank you for all of that in a way that fits what it actually is." "You gave me work that mattered," she said, "and stew when I was hungry." She paused. "It's not nothing, Garrick." He smiled then. The real one, the rare one. She felt it the way she always felt it, like something warm landing in a room that hadn't been warm enough. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right. And I want you to know before I ask it that the answer doesn't change anything about your position here. Whatever you say." She looked at him steadily. "Ask it." He held her gaze. "I'd like to know if you'd be willing to stay." not as the housekeeper. As he stopped, he was not a man who fumbled for words often, which made the fumbling notable. "I'm not good at this kind of talking," he said. "I never have been." "You're doing fine," she said. "I want to know if you'd consider building this with me." The ranch. The life. He looked at her directly with the same level of attention he'd given her on the very first day, in the yard at the gate. "I know it's not easy. I know what this winter cost us, and I know spring won't be simple." "I'm not offering you easy. I don't want easy," she said. "I've been managing easy for 10 years. It turns out easy is just another word for alone." He was quiet. "I'm not the same woman who packed that trunk in October," she said. "Think you know that?" "I know it. And I'm not choosing this because the other door closed." She held his eyes. "I'm choosing it because I walked into the blizzard for you. And I knew when I was doing it what it meant." She paused. "I don't do things without knowing what they mean." He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers, not a dramatic gesture, just his hand, covering hers, the same way he'd covered the other end of her trunk and carried it through the gate 9 months ago. She turned her hand over and held his. Outside, the temperature was dropping again. It would be a cold night, one of the coldest of the winter. The stove was ticking. The lamplight held steady. This was not a perfect moment. He had lines around his eyes from 3 years of managing alone, and she had the particular guardedness of a woman who had learned caution the hard way and would probably never entirely unlearn it. The ranch was still in financial difficulty. The legal challenge was unresolved. Spring was a long way off. None of it felt like a reason to let go of his hand. The news about Kersey came in January, on a Tuesday, delivered by the Billings lawyer's associate, in a letter that arrived with unusual speed for the winter post. Kersey had instructed Aldred to negotiate a settlement. The terms were not everything. They were never everything, but they were significant. The note would be discharged in full. Kersey would pay a settlement amount for the winter wheat damages, which wouldn't cover the entire loss, but would cover enough to bridge the gap through spring planting. In exchange, the legal challenge would be withdrawn and all proceedings closed. There was no admission of wrongdoing. There never was, in these things. But the note was gone. Red Willow was free. Garrick read the letter twice same as the Whitmore letter, same careful rereading of something that was almost too good to trust. Then he set it on the table and looked at it. "It's real," Lenora said. "I know," he said. He looked up at her, the title company information. That was the thing. That was part of it. Without it, we were fighting a legitimate legal provision with a timeline that favored him. With it, he shook his head. He couldn't afford the exposure. No. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, Fitch was doing something in the yard that involved the younger Calloway boy, who had been coming to help 3 times a week since the hay arrangement, a small additional presence that had somehow become normal without anyone deciding it would. The ranch had more people moving through it now than it had in September. That had also become normal. "I need to write to Yates and Dunmore," Garrick said. "And Calder. Tell them the challenge is dropped. They'll need to know what this means for their own situations." "Martha Yates already knows Kersey is backing down," Lenora said. "The Valley talks. But you should write anyway. It should come from you directly." "Yes." He looked at the letter one more time. "Will you?" "I'll draft them," she said. "You sign them." "Right." He folded the settlement letter carefully and put it in his inside coat pocket, which was where he kept the things that mattered. He stood up. He looked at her with an expression she had learned to read across all its variations by now. This particular version was the one that meant he was feeling something larger than he intended to show and was managing the difference. "Lenora," he said. "I know," she said. He nodded. He went back out to work because the ranch didn't pause for good news any more than it paused for bad, and there was always more to do. She watched him go through the kitchen window, the same window she'd watched Kersey's first visit through back in September, standing in the cold draft with her fingers still on the paper. That woman felt like someone she'd read about rather than been. She turned back to the kitchen. She picked up her pencil. She began drafting the letters to Yates and Dunmore and Calder in her careful, precise hand, in the voice that was becoming Red Willow's own voice, built from months of paying attention to what a place needed and what the people in it could bear and what the gap between those two things required. It was the second week of January when she went to her room in the evening and did something she'd been circling for 3 months. She opened the trunk, not to pack it, just to look at what was inside. The savings, which were more than they'd been in April, because she'd been working and spending almost nothing. The 2 books she'd carried from her last position, one a practical household guide, one a collection of American poetry she'd read so many times the spine had gone soft. The small lockbox. The folded paper where she'd been calculating the spring planting cost against the settlement funds, which she'd apparently filed in the trunk without thinking about it. And at the bottom, wrapped in the paper she'd put around it 8 years ago, the unfinished wedding linen. Took it out. It was good quality. She'd had taste even at 22, even when she couldn't afford much. Off-white, nearly cream, with the edging she'd hemmed on 3 sides before the letters stopped. The 4th side still raw. The needle she'd left in it had gone slightly rust-colored at the tip from all the years, and she pulled it out carefully and looked at it. She thought about Emmett's generosity on the day they'd walked the fence line. Let her want something. She thought about what it had cost him to say that, and she thought, not for the first time, that he had been right and that she had loved him honestly once, and that loving someone honestly was never a waste, even when it ended. She smoothed the linen across her lap. The raw edge looked at her. She went to her sewing basket and found a thread that matched well enough. She threaded the least rusted needle she had. She turned the raw edge under and began to hem it slow, even stitches in the low lamplight, not because she was in a hurry and not because it meant any specific thing yet. Just because it was a piece of unfinished work, and she was a woman who finished things. She sat there for an hour, and the lamp burned steadily, and outside the Montana cold pressed against the window, and the ranch was quiet around her. She finished the last inch of hem. She knotted the thread. She folded the linen back along its old creases neatly and put it back in the trunk. But she didn't close the lid. She left the trunk open, something she'd never done, not in 9 months at Red Willow, not in all the years before that. She'd always kept it closed, always kept the latches down, the way you keep a door closed when you're not sure what's on the other side, and you've decided it's safer not to find out. She left it open tonight. She went to bed and slept better than she had in months. Garrick found her in the kitchen the next morning, which was where he always found her, and poured his coffee, which was what he always did, and sat down across from her, which was what they did now. Not because it was arranged, but because it had become the shape of their mornings without either of them designing it. He looked at her. She looked back. "You look different," he said. "I slept well," she said. He considered this. Something happened. "I finished something," she said, "that I started a long time ago." He didn't ask what. He trusted that if she wanted to explain it, she would, and that if she didn't, she had her reasons. This was one of the things about him that she had come to depend on, in the way you depend on things that hold their shape under pressure reliable, not because they're rigid, but because they're consistent. "The spring planting," she said. "I worked out the numbers last night. If we put the settlement funds toward seed first and manage the wages in 2 payments. "Show me," he said. She slid the paper across the table. He picked it up. Their fingers didn't touch, but they nearly did, and she noticed nearly the way she noticed most things about him now, with a particular attention that had stopped pretending to be practical and was simply what it was. He read through the numbers. He asked 2 questions. She answered them. He made one suggestion that she hadn't considered, and she looked at it and said he was right. And he didn't look smug about it, just incorporated it back into the calculation. Outside, the sun was up and the snow was still deep, but it had the quality of late winter snow change somehow, lighter in color, already beginning to think about spring. Olin came in for coffee, took one look at the 2 of them at the table, and poured his cup and took it back out without a word. Fitch came in behind him, saw the same thing, and went back out with slightly less subtlety. Garrick didn't notice, or pretended not to. Lenora noticed, and felt something she hadn't felt in so long that it took her a moment to name it. It was uncomplicated happiness. Not relief, not stability, not the managed absence of pain. Just happiness, plain and impractical, and hers, sitting at a kitchen table in Montana on a January morning, with the sun coming through the window, and a man she trusted reading numbers she'd worked out by lamplight. She let herself feel it. It was the most difficult and most necessary thing she'd done all winter. Spring came to Red Willow the way it always came to Montana, Not all at once, not with any particular announcement, but in accumulation. A morning where the air tasted different. A week where the snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes and exposed the brown grass underneath, matted and flattened and alive. The creek that had been frozen solid since November made a sound one afternoon that Fitch described as the ice groaning, and Olin said no. That was the ice giving up, and there was a difference. Lenora heard it from the kitchen window and understood what Olin meant. Giving up and groaning were different sounds. One fought what was coming. One released it. She had spent most of January and February doing what she always did when circumstances were uncertain, working. The spring planting plan she and Garrick had worked out at the kitchen table in January had become a real document, then a real budget, then a real sequence of actions with real dates attached to them. The settlement funds from Kersey arrived in 3 installments through the Billings lawyer, each one documented and allocated before it cleared. The wheat field that had been destroyed in December was scheduled to be replanted in April with a different variety faster to establish, slightly lower yield, but more resistant to late cold snaps. Olin had suggested it. Lenora had researched it through the agricultural extension correspondence and confirmed it. Garrick had approved it without second-guessing either of them, which was itself a kind of progress. Red Willow was not restored. It was not the same as it had been before the blizzard, before Kersey, before any of the year that had happened. But it was moving forward in a direction that felt chosen rather than forced, and that distinction mattered more than Lenora had words for. She was still working out, daily, what it meant to be a person who had chosen something rather than defaulted to it. Garrick had not asked her again about staying. He didn't need to. What had been said in December at the kitchen table had settled into the fabric of their daily life the way most true things settle. Not loudly, not with any ceremony, but with the weight of something that had found its right place and stopped moving. He didn't treat her differently in front of the hands, which she respected. He wasn't a demonstrative man by nature, and she didn't want performance from him. She wanted what she'd always gotten from him, which was honesty and steadiness, and the particular kind of attention that meant he was actually looking at her, rather than the version of her he'd decided to see. What changed was smaller than that. It was the way he turned and looked for her in a room before he'd finished the thought he was going to share. The way he started leaving the ranch correspondence on the kitchen table in the morning, rather than bringing it to her separately, as if the kitchen table had quietly become the shared space where Red Willow's thinking happened. The way on cold evenings when the fire in the front room was going, he'd settle in one chair and she'd settle in the other, and they'd read or work in silence for hours with the easy comfort of people who have stopped needing to fill the quiet with proof that they belonged to it. She noticed all of this. She didn't annotate it. She just let it be what it was. The letter from Emmett came in February. She hadn't expected it, and when she saw the handwriting on the envelope in the mail run, she felt the particular tightening she associated with things she'd thought were finished. She read it alone in her room. He had found work. Not just the Billings contract, a larger opportunity. A building firm in Denver that had approached him based on his reputation. He was going to go. He wanted her to know he was going and that he wished her well, genuinely, without any subtext in it. He wrote that he had thought about what she'd said on the fence line in November and that he thought she'd been right, not just about him, but about the larger thing. That she was different now, and that different wasn't worse. It was just truer, and he hoped she'd stop being afraid of how true it was. You deserve the life you're actually living, he wrote. Not the one you've been keeping in reserve in case the real one doesn't work out. She read that twice. Then she folded the letter and put it in her writing desk and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the surface. She thought about the trunk in the corner, the linen, hemmed now on all 4 sides, lying folded inside it. She thought about how she'd left the lid open in January, and how it had stayed open since, not as a statement, just because it turned out she didn't need it closed anymore. She thought about what Emmett had said, and she thought that he was a good man and that his life in Denver would suit him, and that she was glad he'd said what he'd said because it was true and because she needed to hear it, said by someone who had earned the right to say it. She was not keeping Red Willow in reserve. She understood that now, cleanly, without argument. She got up and went back to work. March arrived with mud, which was its own kind of optimism. the first real sign that the valley was recovering, not just Red Willow, but the whole community of ranches and families and interconnected obligations that the blizzard had shaken and the subsequent weeks had reestablished on different terms came on a Tuesday when Roy Yates and his eldest son showed up at the ranch with a wagon full of fence posts. No letter, no advance notice. Just Roy in the yard, looking at the northwest fence line where the cattle had gone through in December, saying, "Better before the ground thaws all the way." Garrick stood in the yard and looked at Roy and said, "You didn't have to come." Roy said, "I know," and got the first post off the wagon. Garrick picked up the other end without further discussion. They worked through the morning in the cold, which had gone from killing cold to merely uncomfortable. Lenora brought coffee out at 10 o'clock, and Roy drank his without stopping work entirely, which she'd come to understand was the highest compliment available to a man of Roy Yates's particular economy of motion. Cobb and Fitch joined them after noon. The Dunmore family's second son came over in the afternoon, having heard from somewhere the valley's communication network was faster than any postal service, that there was fence work happening. By evening, the northwest line was solid. Garrick stood at the repaired fence in the fading light and looked at it for a long time. Lenora came and stood beside him. "Strange feeling," he said. "What kind of strange?" "Good strange." He looked at the posts, the new wire, the work of other people's hands in his ground. "I spent 3 years thinking being beholden to anyone was the same as being weak." "I know, I was wrong about that. Yes," she said. "You were." He glanced at her sideways. "You could let me arrive at that without agreeing so fast." "I could," she said, "but you'd trust it less if I hedged." He made the sound that was almost a laugh. It was fully a laugh this time, she realized. The difference was small, but it was there, something looser in it than she'd heard before. He was letting himself be less managed. She wasn't sure he'd noticed. She wasn't going to point it out. They walked back to the house in the cold, with the sky going pink and orange over the mountains to the west, and neither of them said anything, and it was the best kind of quiet. The Kersey situation resolved itself in stages over February and March, each stage a little less dramatic than the one before, which was how real endings usually went, not with any single decisive moment, but with the accumulated weight of consequences finding their level. Aldred withdrew from representing Kersey in mid-February, which the Billings lawyer described in a letter as not unprecedented in these circumstances, and which Lenora translated for Garrick as, Aldred had assessed the exposure from the land title company issue and decided his own reputation was worth more than Kersey's fight. Without Aldred, Kersey's legal position was considerably weaker. His own capabilities were in acquisition and pressure, not in the technical work of territorial land law. He spent 6 weeks attempting to find other representation and found no one in the territory willing to take the case on the terms he was offering, which was to say on the terms of a man who expected to win and wasn't willing to pay the price of a fight that might not go his way. In March, the territorial court received notice that Bramwell Kersey was withdrawing the original enforcement action entirely and accepting the settlement terms as final. The note was discharged. The legal challenge was closed. The land title company was still operating, but under increased scrutiny from the territorial recorder's office, which had been quietly examining Kersey's filings since January on the basis of information submitted by the Billings lawyer. Kersey did not come to Red Willow again. He did not send Pratt. Whether he was diminished or merely quiet, Lenora couldn't say. She thought the distinction mattered less than people assumed. A man who could no longer operate through concealment and surprise had lost his primary tool, regardless of what he thought of himself privately. What she knew with certainty was this: the Yates Ranch kept its land. The Dunmore family kept its land. Red Willow kept its land. And the informal agreement that had begun to form among those families over the winter about shared grazing rights in emergencies, about coordinated supply purchasing, about the kind of collective knowledge that made each individual operation more resilient. That agreement hardened through the spring into something real and documented. Garrick organized the first formal meeting of what would eventually be called the Valley's Grazing Cooperative at Red Willow in late March. 7 families came. Lenora made coffee for 30 people and took notes that would become the first record of what the cooperative agreed to. She wrote the agreement herself, in the kitchen, after the meeting, from her notes, and from memory, and from her understanding of what each family needed and what they could give. She showed it to Garrick before she showed it to anyone else. He read it in full. He made 2 changes. He looked up and said, "This is right." She sent it out the next week. Every family signed. April came. The wheat field was replanted on the 14th, which was later than Garrick wanted, and earlier than the weather had seemed willing to allow. A negotiation between human urgency and Montana's indifferent timetable that resolved itself when 3 days of warm sun arrived, and Olin said now. Today, this is the window, and Garrick believed him. All 4 hands worked the replanting. The younger Calloway boy came, as he often did now, having become something between a fixture and an informal apprentice. Roy Yates's eldest son came, honoring the reciprocal labor agreement that Lenora had arranged in January with the hay. Garrick worked beside all of them from first light to last. Lenora worked the field in the morning and left the detailed agricultural work to the people who knew it better than she did, which was an acknowledgement she'd come to through observation rather than any formal assessment. She knew her capacities. She knew where she added the most and where she added the least, and she had stopped pretending the line between them didn't exist. In the afternoon, she stayed in the kitchen and prepared the meal that would feed 12 people at the end of the day's work. And she did it without resentment and without the feeling of being relegated, because feeding 12 people who were putting your livelihood back into the ground was not a lesser contribution than being one of the 12. She had argued this position to herself once in October from a place of defensiveness. Now she simply understood it. The meal was loud and tired, and someone spilled coffee across Roy Yates's elbow, which Roy accepted with the stoicism of a man who has been worked past caring about minor indignities. Fitch played the harmonica again, better than at Christmas, the practice showing. The Calloway boy turned out to have a decent singing voice, which surprised everyone, including himself. Garrick sat at the head of the table, and Lenora sat at the other end, and between them was the noise and warmth of a house that had been too quiet for too long. Afterward, when everyone else was gone, and the hands had retreated to the bunkhouse, and the kitchen was clean, and the fire was low, Garrick came and stood in the kitchen doorway. "Ask me what you're going to ask me," Lenora said. She was at the table with the household accounts, not because they needed urgent attention, but because habit was habit. "How did you know I was going to ask something? You've been standing in that doorway for 2 minutes." He came in and sat down. He put his hands flat on the table, which he did when he was organizing a thought that required care. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and I want you to let me finish it before you tell me why I've constructed it badly." "I can't promise that," she said, "but I'll try." He looked at her. "I want to marry you. I've wanted to say that since January, and I kept finding reasons to wait until things were more settled. And then I realized things are never going to be more settled than this. There will always be something. The wheat, the fence, the legal problem, whatever comes next." He paused. "I'm not asking because the ranch is in better shape, and I want to be practical about it. I'm asking because I don't want to go to sleep another night in this house thinking of you as..." He stopped. His jaw moved. "Thinking of you as anything other than someone I chose, that I'm asking to choose me back." Lenora looked at him. She had prepared over the winter for a range of emotional contingencies. She had not prepared for the word chose, for the way he said it, the particular weight he put on it, as if he understood exactly what it meant to her specifically, as if he had been paying the same quality of attention to her that she'd been paying to him since the first morning. She should have known he had been. He was that kind of person. She'd known it for months. "I told you in December I wasn't going anywhere," she said. "I know. I'm asking for more than not going." She looked at her hands on the table. Then she looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Just that. No qualification, no hedge, no careful management of the exposure. Just yes," said plainly, the way she'd learned to say the things that mattered. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Same as December, she turned her hand over and held his. Same as December, but different, weighted differently now, carrying something that December had only been pointing toward. "There's something I want to do first," she said. He waited. "Trunk," she said, "in my room. There's something in it I've been carrying for 8 years. I want to take it out and use it. I want to finish what I started when I thought I had a future coming." She looked at him steadily. I hemmed the last edge in January. I just need to use it. He didn't ask what it was. He understood, she could see, that it was something hers, something from before him, before Red Willow, from the woman who had sealed herself in amber and survived on principle alone. He understood that the right response was not curiosity but steadiness. "All right," he said. She held his hand, and the fire burned down, and outside the April night was cold still, but the cold had changed its character, the cold of a season ending rather than a season pressing down. They married in June under the cottonwoods beside the ranch house. It was not an elaborate ceremony, because neither of them wanted elaborate, and they had learned, separately and together, that wanting the thing you actually want is considerably more efficient than performing the thing you think you should want. 7 people were present: Olin, Dex, Cobb, Fitch, Roy and Martha Yates, and the Calloway boy, who had become in some unannounced way a fixture of Red Willow's daily life. Lenora wore the linen she'd started at 22 and finished at 30. It was not a wedding dress. It had never been intended as a wedding dress, just good fabric hemmed carefully by someone who believed in the future enough to do it right. But it was hers. It had been waiting in that trunk across 10 years and 2 lives and 1 winter that had changed everything. And she wore it on a June morning under the cottonwoods, and it fit the way things fit when they found their right time. Garrick looked at her in a way that she would not describe to anyone, not because it was private, but because there were no words for it that wouldn't reduce it. He was not a man who looked at things carelessly. When he looked at her that morning, he was looking at her completely, all of it. The woman who had walked 3 miles with her own trunk, and the woman who had ridden into a blizzard, and every version of her in between, and he was not confused by any of it. Martha Yates cried. She said afterward it was the wind in her eyes. Everyone accepted this graciously. Olin said nothing, but he ate 2 pieces of the cake Lenora had made, the same dried apple cake from Christmas, which from Olin constituted the equivalent of a speech. Fitch played the harmonica well enough that people actually listened, which was how you knew he'd really learned it. Later, much later, when the afternoon had gone long and everyone else had drifted home, or to the bunkhouse, and the cottonwoods were making their summer sound in the light wind, Garrick and Lenora sat on the porch steps in the early evening and looked at the valley. The wheat field was coming up. New variety, different from before. The rows slightly thinner, but the color good. Olin's had said last week that it looked healthy. Lenora had written it in the ledger. Garrick had gone to look for himself and come back saying the same thing in fewer words. "I used to sit here alone," Garrick said. He wasn't being mournful about it, just noting a fact. "Even before Rafe left, I was always here alone, mostly." "Did you mind it?" she asked. He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he thought about things. "I didn't know what to mind," he said. "You can't miss something you don't know to want." She understood this with her whole history. "No," she said. "Can't. I spent a long time being careful," he said. "About the ranch. About money. About what I let myself need." He looked at the mountains, which were still white at the highest elevations, which they would be through July. "I thought careful was the same as safe. I thought the same thing," she said. "We were both wrong. We were both right in pieces," she said. "Careful matters. It's just not sufficient." He looked at her. What's sufficient? She considered it. Outside the comfortable shorthand of their daily life, it was harder to say. "Letting something cost you," she said finally. "Not recklessly. But actually letting it cost you. The wheat field. The trunk. The letters I didn't send and the one I did." She looked at her hands. "I spent 10 years protecting myself from loss by not having anything to lose. And it worked. I was very successfully not losing anything." She paused. "I was also not living, and now?" She looked at the wheat field, the fence lines, the mountains, the sky going gold at the edges. "Now I'm living," she said. "And it's terrifying, and I'm going to keep doing it." He took her hand. She let him. This is the thing about people like Lenora Wrenfield, and there are more of them than you might expect. Moving through the world with their careful systems and their closed trunks and their perfectly maintained exits. They do not change because someone loves them. Love alone is not sufficient. It is not a cure for the particular wound of a person who has decided that wanting leads to losing. What changes them, if anything changes them, is a specific sequence of events that no one can arrange deliberately. It is the accumulation of evidence. evidence that a place is real, that a person is reliable not because they're perfect, but because they're consistent, that the fear was right. Loving things means risking losing them, but that the math had been done wrong, because not loving things is also a kind of loss, the slow and unspecific kind that takes everything quietly rather than all at once, and that you only notice in retrospect when you look at a decade and understand that you were very safe in it and very alone. Lenora did not become someone without fear. She carried her caution into her marriage and her working life, and the decisions she made about the ranch and the Valley Cooperative and every other thing she turned her considerable mind to. What changed was simpler and harder than the disappearance of fear. What changed was that she stopped letting fear make the decisions. There's a difference. It's not a comfortable difference. It requires constant small acts of courage that no one notices and no one applauds, the daily choice to keep the trunk open, to let the morning be ordinary and good without preparing for its ending. It is, in fact, the hardest thing most people ever do. The cooperative became something real through the summer and fall of that year, expanding to 11 families by October. Lenora ran the administrative side of it, not because she was asked, not because it was her job, but because someone had to do it, and she was the most qualified person available, and she had stopped that qualification behind the title of housekeeper. She was not universally loved for this. There were 2 men in the valley who found her directness difficult to accommodate and made their feelings known through the particular passive method of not quite looking at her during meetings. She noted this and adjusted her communication approach with those specific people without changing her substance, because the substance was correct and the adjustment was purely tactical. Martha Yates told her once, bluntly, "Half these men don't know how to take you." "I know," Lenora said. "It's going to keep happening." "I know that too," she said. "I've decided I can tolerate being difficult to take." Martha laughed, not politely but genuinely. "Good," she said. Garrick never had any difficulty taking her. This was either luck or good judgment on his part, and she had decided it was both. He had seen her clearly from the beginning, not idealized, not managed, not filtered through what he expected a woman in her position to be. He had seen the person doing the work and responded to the work, which was the most honest form of respect available. She had needed that. She had not known she needed it until she had it. The autumn after they married, Lenora wrote a letter to her youngest sister in Missouri. She had not written home in 2 years, a gap she had maintained with the efficiency of someone removing a source of noise. Her family was not cruel. They were simply people she had spent herself on for a decade, and the spending had left her so depleted that distance had become a survival mechanism rather than a choice. She wrote now because she was, for the first time in memory, not depleted. She had something to spare. She told her sister about Red Willow, about the winter, the blizzard, the cooperative, about Garrick carefully, in the restrained way she communicated about things that mattered too much to risk making small with the wrong words. She said she had married well, meaning not that she had married money or position, but that she had married someone who understood the terms of the transaction and had met them honestly. She did not say she was happy. She distrusted that word. It was too large and too absolute for the reality, which was that happiness for Lenora existed in smaller denominations and was more durable for it. What she said was that she had found a life she'd chosen rather than a life that had happened to her, and that the difference between those two things was everything. Her sister wrote back in November with the kind of warmth that suggested the gap had been felt on the other side, too, and with news about the siblings and the small, ordinary developments of lives lived elsewhere. Lenora read the letter at the kitchen table and felt something open in her chest that had been closed for a long time. She wrote back. The winter of the following year was hard, though not as hard as the one before. There was a late cold snap in March that worried everyone, and a fence issue in the east pasture that cost 3 days of emergency repair work. Garrick pulled something in his shoulder doing the repair and spent a week being more irritable than usual about being unable to work at his full capacity, which Lenora found unreasonable and told him so, and they had a real argument about it. Not the careful negotiated kind, but the messy human kind, where both people say things that are partly true and partly the anger talking and have to sort out the difference afterward. They sorted it out. It took a day and a half, and neither of them was graceful about it. But they sorted it out, which was the thing that mattered, and on the other side of it, Something had actually resolved rather than just been avoided. This was also new. Lenora had spent her life avoiding conflict the way you avoid unstable ground carefully, by watching where she put her feet. She had been extremely good at it. What she had not understood was that avoiding conflict in close quarters didn't eliminate it. It just pushed it underground, where it stayed, until it became something larger than the original thing. A real argument was not, it turned out, the end of something. It was sometimes the most direct route through. By the second spring, Red Willow had found its new shape. It was not the same ranch it had been when Garrick was running it alone and barely running it. It was not restored to some prior version of itself. There was no prior version to restore, because the version that existed now had not existed before. It was a ranch that had been through something real and had come out changed rather than damaged. The new wheat variety performed well, not spectacularly. There was a wet week in May that affected the southern quarter, but solidly and honestly, which was what they'd hoped for. The cooperative shared grazing agreement held through 2 separate minor emergencies in other families' operations, which was the proof that the structure worked. Kersey's influence in the valley had contracted to the edges of his own property and stayed there. The territorial land title inquiry had not resulted in formal charges, but it had resulted in the kind of scrutiny that made a man with undisclosed interests in multiple transactions considerably more cautious about his next set of moves. Fitch turned 19 and asked Garrick about increasing his responsibilities, and Garrick gave him the East Pasture management and told him to check with Olin on anything he wasn't sure about. Fitch took this seriously in a way he hadn't taken anything seriously at 17, which was how it was supposed to work. The responsibility preceding the readiness developing in response. Olin remained Olin unchanging in the way of things that have found their permanent form, his weather predictions accurate, his coffee black, his opinions offered rarely and worth more for it. Dex and Cobb were still arguing. The specific subjects had shifted. Now it was less about ranch methods and more about which of the women in town was worth pursuing and what constituted a proper approach to the subject, which Lenora could hear from the kitchen on Sunday evenings and found considerably more entertaining than she let on. One evening in the second summer, Garrick came in from evening rounds and found Lenora at the kitchen table with the trunk. Not the supplies trunk, not the household storage her trunk, the one she'd carried from Missouri. She'd moved it to the corner of the bedroom when they'd married, and he'd never mentioned it, not once, understanding with the instinctive tact that was one of his better qualities that it was hers to open and close on her own terms. She had it open on the kitchen table now, and she was taking things out. The books went to the shelf. The lockbox, its contents, long since integrated into the household accounts, went to the study. The emergency money that had never been spent went into the household reserve fund where it would be available if anything needed it. At the bottom, the linen. She held it up. It was the linen she'd worn in June under the cottonwoods. She'd laundered it carefully afterward and folded it back along its old creases and put it away without thinking much about why. She looked at it now. Garrick stood in the kitchen doorway, his customary position when something was happening that he wanted to understand before weighing in, and watched her. "I'm trying to decide what to do with it," she said. "What are the options?" She looked at the linen. "Keep it in the trunk. Put it in the chest with the good household linens." Or she stopped. "Or what?" he said. "Use it," she said. "Actually use it. Not as a keepsake. Cut it into something practical and use it until it's worn out." He came into the kitchen and stood at the table and looked at the linen. He was quiet for a moment. "What does your instinct say?" he said. She looked at it a while longer. "Use it," she said. "It's good fabric and it's been folded long enough." He nodded. "All right." She folded it differently this time. Not along the old creases, but new ones, working out in her head what she'd make from it, something functional that would be handled every day and would eventually show the handling. She put it back in the trunk temporarily refolded. Then she looked at the empty trunk. Just a trunk. Good solid construction. The left handle still more reliable than the right. A traveling trunk, and she was not, for the first time in her adult life, going anywhere. She closed the lid. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked it up and carried it to the barn and put it in the storage section with the other equipment. She came back to the kitchen. Garrick was still there, which she'd expected. Done, he said. Done, she said. She sat down at the table, and he sat across from her, and the kitchen was its ordinary self around them. The stove, the window, the lamp, the ledgers, all the materials of a life being lived rather than held in reserve. Outside, it was a Montana summer evening, long light staying late the way it did up here, the mountains holding the color after the rest of the sky had let it go. A hawk was making a slow circle over the south pasture. The creek was running clear and full with the snowmelt, audible from where they sat if they were quiet. They were quiet. It was the kind of quiet that is full, rather than empty full of the day just finished, and the day coming, and the ordinary, extraordinary fact of being in a specific place, with a specific person who sees you clearly and stays anyway. Lenora had spent a long time believing that this kind of quiet would frighten her, that she would always be waiting for it to end, listening for the footstep that meant someone was leaving, calculating the exit before the thing itself could tell her it was over. She was not frightened. She was in the small, durable, honest denomination that she'd come to trust happy. Not because nothing could go wrong. Things would go wrong. The ranch would have bad years, and the weather would be indifferent, and the work would be difficult, and she and Garrick would have more arguments of the messy human kind, and would have to find their way through each one without a map. She was happy because she was here for all of it, not managing from a distance, not with one foot already out the door, not with the trunk packed in the corner in case she needed to disappear. Here, fully, choosing it every morning the way Garrick had asked her to, one morning at a time, each one building on the last until they became a life that was recognizably hers. She had dreamed of nothing for a very long time. She had not understood that the dreaming was not the dangerous part. The dangerous part was waking up and deciding to stay. She had stayed. She was staying. And in the long light of a Montana summer evening, with the creek running full outside the window, and the man she had chosen sitting across from her at the table, where both their lives were now kept, Lenora Wrenfield, Lenora Thorne, finally, quietly, unreservedly let herself have it.